responsible and clear approach to the handling of this issue is Mr Gray's colleague Ed Balls and his two allies in the Tory Treasury.
Thank you. That ends topical questions. The next item of business is a debate on motion number 9447 in the name of Keith Brown on young and novice drivers and graduated driving licensing. I'll allow a few moments for the front benches to arrange themselves, and I invite those members who are taking part in the debate to press the request to speak button now. I now call on Keith Brown to speak to move the motion. Minister, you've got 10 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. When this Government published Scotland's Road Safety Framework, one of the priorities we set out was for young drivers aged 17 to 25. And young people aged 17 to 25 make up 10% of licence holders, yet they account for 23% of drivers involved in injury road accidents over the last 5 years in Scotland. I'm delighted, Presiding Officer, we have a number of young people in the public gallery, and hopefully they can stay for as much of the debate as possible. Being a priority group means a substantial amount of our road safety resource in Transport Scotland, and Road Safety Scotland in particular, is focused on interventions for young and inexperienced drivers. And in 2007 we undertook a world first when Road Safety Scotland used the Xbox Live to deliver drink drive and then country road messages to young Scots using this online gaming platform. And my road safety team tells me the second person to use this platform was somebody called Barack Obama in his first presidential campaign. Although in recent years the casualty numbers for 17 to 25-year-olds has fallen slightly, they are still disproportionate to other age groups, and I believe that's a clear indication that other measures need to be considered. And I think a number of members here will have spoken directly to the parents of those who have lost children in that age group, and will know how heartbreaking it is for those parents, the circumstances of the death of a loved one. Today's debate is the latest stage in a long process whereby the Scottish Government has listened, gathered evidence and advocated an approach to road safety for young and inexperienced drivers, which includes some form of graduated driving licence, and that includes debate with young people themselves, crucially. Frustratingly, though, this is as far as we can go at present, as GDL is a reserved issue. Despite our repeated attempts to engage and encourage the UK Government to take action on this issue, we still don't even have the promised Green Paper setting out the UK Government's intentions. On the 18th of December 2013, via a written answer in the UK Parliament, Stephen Hammond announced the postponement of the publication of that Green Paper, and we now understand that it's been postponed indefinitely. Now, that announcement was met with widespread condemnation from the road safety community within the UK, and was also the subject of an early-day motion deploring that decision. There is a long timeline of our constant intercession with the UK Government on this matter. It began with our response to the Driving Standards Agency consultation in 2008 on learning to drive, where we indicated our broad support for GDL, graduated driving licences. I have since written several times to the UK Government, including my latest letter in January of this year, which I have tabled, that urges the UK Government to either take action or to give consideration to the powers that the Scottish Government would require to do so in Scotland. The Scottish Parliament itself last debated young driver safety on the 7th of September 2011 and supported the view that if a graduated licence scheme was introduced in Scotland, up to 19 lives per year could be saved. It is my intention, Presiding Officer, to accept. I will do.
I know the Minister is very familiar with the research from Dr Sarah Jones of Cardiff University, which is quoted, I think, in the Labour amendment. But the UK figure on a graduated driving licence, the evidence that she looked at, said that a scheme would save 114 deaths and 872 serious casualties each year. I'll be happy to put the reference in Spice, but I'm sure the Minister is familiar with that reference.
Minister.
Thank you. I am indeed familiar with that reference. I would also say that in relation to the Labour Party amendment, which I am happy to support, I would say that the latest figure that we have from Sarah Jones is 19. Obviously, that's a more recent figure than the one that's quoted in the amendment. But our understanding now is around 19 lives per year could be saved in Scotland, recognising the figure mentioned for the UK. And also, we shouldn't forget, aside from the tragedy of the individual fatalities, we also end up paying around £2 million per fatality in Scotland as well. So Another figure being mentioned by Sarah Jones was, I think, around £80 million of savings based on the 22 fatalities that were mentioned before. That assertion, as I say, is based on that research by Sarah Jones of the University of Cardiff in 2010. And Dr Jones presented this evidence to me and to Road Safety Partners in March 2011. She also presented the annual Road Safety Scotland seminar in October 2011, when the whole seminar was built around the theme of young driver safety with a focus on GDL. And the evidence base shows that GDL remains the only young driver intervention for which there is clear and unambiguous evidence to show that it reduces the crash rate for new and young drivers. Now, various forms of GDL, certainly.
I'm most grateful. Would the Minister be able to tell Parliament exactly what he defines as GDL in the context of the remarks he's making?
Keith Brown.
Well, of course, there are different. I was just going to say about the different GDL systems that there are around the world, and they have different characteristics. And what I would say is, if we have the power to take this forward, if the UK government doesn't want to do that, then what we want to do is consult on those different aspects. You can see, for example, I think there's about 12 different characteristics in the Northern Irish proposed GDL system. They've ruled out, for example, an inhibition on nighttime driving, which is one thing you could look at. But there's also, crucially, most systems have at their root the idea that there should be a longer period of gaining experience in driving before being fully licensed. But the exact characteristics of a GDL, of course, should be subject to consultation. But various forms are well established in other countries around the world, including the US, Australia and New Zealand. And the DFT's own evidence review, carried out last year by the Transport Research Laboratory, concluded that the potential public health benefits of a GDL system for new drivers are indisputable. That's the UK government's own department saying that the health benefits of a GDL system for new drivers are indisputable. The UK government subsequently said that the TRL research, for their point of view, was based mainly on countries which they don't think have the same road safety records to match that of the UK, and that a balance has to be struck, and they're right in this, of course, between driver safety and the freedoms of young people. But I would also assert that Sweden, which is included in the TRL study and has one of the best safety records in the world in terms of road safety, might disagree with that former statement. However, I do agree that we have to look at balancing safety and freedoms for young and novice drivers, and I'll go on to discuss that shortly. We know from the evidence that young drivers are more at risk at night, and they're more at risk when there are other young people in the car. And an analysis of UK road crash data collected from 2000 to 2009 found that 25.1% of young driver crashes occurred between 9 o'clock and 6 a.m. The impairment effect on the driving of drinking alcohol is also greater in young people. The purpose of a GDL system is to reduce exposure to high-risk situations for young and experienced drivers, allowing them to build up skill through practice. In most countries, to go back to the point that Tavish Scott made, there is also a pre-test element of a GDL, where a minimum learning period set with a number of conditions, including driving in different weather and different times of day, and with a logbook to evidence compliance. And the TRL report recommends a gold standard GDL system. That's the UK government's report recommends a gold standard GDL system, which includes components such as limitations on nighttime driving on passengers under 25, and it also suggests a lower minimum blood alcohol level. The gold standard GDL system is often not in place at the outset. However, once a GDL system is in place, many jurisdictions, and for example Australia, have gone on to strengthen that system. So Transport Scotland officials, along with partners including the Road Safety Strategic Partnership Board, have been working towards developing a set of proposals and options for possible forms of GDL in Britain, initially with a view to submitting a response to the now postponed Green Paper. I say Great Britain because Northern Ireland already has a form of GDL, as I mentioned, which they are looking to strengthen through legislation in the near future. And I also mentioned the need to balance young people's freedoms and needs with their safety. It's been suggested that GDL might hinder education or employment opportunities. However, a study in New Zealand found little evidence that GDL caused any practical difficulties to travel for academic or work purposes. And even if you consider the fact that around 25% of young people in this age group in the UK have a licence in the first place, it can't be the case that other 75% are disadvantaged in that way. However, we need to make sure that any proposed GDL scheme supports young and novice drivers, both in terms of safety and in reduced insurance premiums. And this is a crucial point, I think, which should be realised. I think most members will have had representations from people who say it's very difficult for young people to get insurance to allow them to drive in the first place, at the very start of their driving career. And we believe that a GDL system can help with that. We know that affordability of car insurance for young drivers is a barrier, but a report in October 2012 from the Association of British Insurers recommended the introduction of GDL and stated that if the number of crashes involving young drivers decreases, the financial risk they pose to an insurer will decrease, and insurance premiums for young drivers will follow. So the risk is a real risk. It's not something that's been invented by the government. It's recognised by different governments across the world. The statistics for young drivers prove that beyond doubt, and the evidence for GDL is compelling. The FD's own evidence review last year confirmed this, and I don't doubt that much discussion would need to be had, as Tavish Scott has hinted, as to the type of system we could implement, not least with young people themselves. And that's why, at an earlier stage, we had a national debate with young people about their views on different aspects, and they were supportive of some aspects and not so supportive of other aspects. But I very much believe that we need to have that discussion now. And the refusal by the UK Government, especially given its previous statements, is absolutely bewildering. And that's why, given what I've said, that I today lay this motion before members and call on UK ministers to develop and take forward proposals on GDL without further delay, or to grant Scottish ministers the powers to do so in Scotland. I move the motion in my name.
Many thanks, Minister. And I now call on Mark Griffin to speak to and to move Amendment 9447.2. Excuse me, 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to speak in the debate today, which is primarily about road safety, reducing the number of injuries and fatalities on roads across Scotland. We might argue about how we go about doing that this afternoon, but one thing we won't disagree on is the devastating impact it can have on a person's life if they are injured in a car accident, if they have caused injury or even loss of life in an accident, the impact on lives of the friends and families of people who have died in car crashes, and the impact on emergency service staff in terms of the mental trauma in dealing with those accidents and the financial impact on services. I think it's right that when young people aged 17 to 25 make up 23% of the drivers who are involved in injury road accidents, despite making up only 10% of those who hold a licence, as highlighted by the Minister, and that young drivers who drive are only around 5% of road miles but are involved in 22% of all crashes, that we really should have particular focus on this area. Road traffic accidents remain the #1 threat to young people's safety, and we'll be supporting the Government motion tonight. The Labour Party across the UK have been calling for the Government to bring forward the Green Paper on young driver safety, and have called for the inclusion of a graduated licence scheme in the paper for discussion and consultation. Dave Stewart, our own MSP, was also awarded a Parliamentarian of the Year award by the Road Safety Campaign Group break for his campaign on a graduated driver licensing scheme. We also recognise the contribution made to research over the past 10 years in Scotland on the impact of a graduated licence scheme by Dr Sarah Jones of Cardiff University, and take on board the point that the Minister makes that the research has been updated to reflect a new figure, but still a substantial figure, on the number of lives which could be saved per year. Graduated driver licensing has a proven evidence base and requires serious consideration. The licensing system would aim to enable young and novice drivers to build up ability and experience through a structured and phased approach. And graduated driver licensing exists in various forms in many countries, including already within the UK, but exact components differ. Common elements of that graduated driver licence include a minimum learning period, minimum required amounts of on-road supervised practice, and a minimum age at which novice drivers can graduate to the intermediate stage. That intermediate stage which places additional restrictions on young and novice drivers, such as restrictions on solo nighttime driving for all novice drivers and restrictions on carrying passengers. Other components include a lower alcohol limit and a ban on hands-free mobile phone use while driving. These are all worthy suggestions, but should be investigated further to see if they can be implemented in such a way which reduces road accidents, reduces the insurance premiums of young drivers, particularly those who struggle to pay the costs of insurance because of the impact of those statistics showing that young drivers are more likely to be involved in accidents, and also, crucially, to make sure that any of those suggestions don't impact on the ability of a young person to travel for work. But this isn't just about the UK Government, though. The Scottish Government also need to come forward with proposals to tackle road safety, particularly in that young driver category. In 2011, Transport Scotland made a number of recommendations to improve safety and limit the risk of traffic-related collisions and accidents in young drivers. Recommendations like continue to encourage a lifelong approach to learning in all schools as part of the curriculum for excellence through the provision of free resources and support to help ensure that all pupils are taught about road safety issues as pedestrians and cyclists, as car passengers and as future drivers. I just wonder, just as the Minister gets ready to take his feet, how many local authorities, schools and pupils have been able to benefit from those free resources?
Minister.
What I was going to say in relation to his earlier point was when he said there's more that can be done. Of course, there's always more that can be done, but I would hope he would recognise that the number of younger drivers killed has fallen by 2/3 since the RSF baseline period 2004-2008. It was first recording the figure, so a 2/3 drop is pretty significant improvement on the schools. I'll come back to that in my closing speech if I could.
Mark Griffin.
Yep. We acknowledge the drop and purely flag up the recommendations that were made in that 2011 report and ask for a progress update on that. Another recommendation in that report was to ensure that police enforcement continues to be a priority and is undertaken in a strategic and targeted manner, focusing on those young drivers most at risk. And again, asked the Minister if he's able to update the Chamber as to what Police Scotland are doing to focus on young drivers, particularly those who have recently passed their test. Could I also ask what the Scottish Prison Service is doing in terms of rehabilitating young drivers who have been given prison sentences for driving offences, and the potential there is, as part of that rehab process, for those serving sentences to help educate young people. If people were able to share their experiences with younger people, it would contribute towards their own rehabilitation and the knowledge that they were helping to reduce the problem. And I say that in the knowledge of that I went to school with a man who was convicted of causing death by dangerous driving as a teenager, who's then had to live with the consequences of that right through his life, and while not as much of an impact on that young person who died, it's still something that he will continue to live with and would have liked to have been able to contribute towards the education of young people to help that stopping happening in the future. Presiding Officer, I don't want to be accused of ageism today in focusing my remarks on young drivers, but I think the statistics do speak for themselves, and I repeat what I said earlier, that road accidents are the biggest threat to the lives of young people today. We support the motion before us in the Minister's name, repeat the calls for the UK Government to bring forward its Green Paper on young driver safety, ask the Minister what action the Government is taking right now, and also ask members to support the amendment in my name, which I now move. Thank you.
Many thanks. And I now call on Alex Johnson to speak to and move Amendment 9447.1. Around 6 minutes, please, Mr Johnson.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I begin by moving the amendment in my name. One of the great things about this Parliament is that we have a diversity of members. And while we may look the same and may have similar experiences in some areas, some of us bring very different experiences to this Parliament. And when it comes to driving, I have to say that my experience was very different. I come from a family, in fact a community, where driving is not something that happens when you're 17 or whatever. It's something that you begin to do as soon as your feet reach the pedals. Away from the public roads, young people in the rural community very quickly become familiar with the driving techniques that they will use later in life. When working with agricultural machinery, it's possible to be licensed to drive some very heavy and potentially dangerous machinery on the public road as early as the age of 16. And many who grew up in that agricultural community will have been operating that same machinery in an off-road environment for a very long time before they actually pass a test. The reason why I say this is that I think there is plenty of evidence out there that would suggest that age as a guide to ability on the road is probably a misleading indicator. The fact is that there is evidence that it is not necessarily an accurate one. Yet at the same time, there is also evidence to suggest that inexperienced drivers are among the most likely to become involved in accidents. In the North East in particular, where Aberdeenshire is crisscrossed by a web of A-class roads, the problem of young men, in particular young men, I'm not being sexist here, getting into powerful cars and doing excessive speeds, eventually injuring or killing themselves or their friends, is something which we have also become used to. Yet at the same time, I believe we have lost our place as far as policing is concerned. Yes.
David Stewart.
I'm grateful for the member allowing the intervention. Does the member recognise the statistic that 1 in 5 newly qualified drivers crash within 6 months, and these tend to be men under age 25 in rural roads?
Alice Johnston.
Indeed, I do. And I believe that while there are a number of reasons for that, one, not least of which, that many of these young men are, of course, overconfident and are perfectly able to drive sensibly when they wish to. The problem is that they pass their test too easily, the system does not identify them, and then they go ahead and have accidents. Yet, moving on to the area of policing, I believe that we have made a number of mistakes when it comes to the policing of our roads and the enforcement of safety. I have been accused in the past of being an opponent of speed cameras. Let me clarify that. I am not necessarily opposed to speed cameras. I believe, however, that the over-reliance on speed cameras as the only way of policing our roads is, in fact, an abdication of responsibility in many cases, and that cameras themselves do not necessarily improve safety. There is a great deal more that can be done to improve the safety of our roads. And that's why I'm concerned about the route we may be choosing to take. The idea that legislation can in itself improve safety is one which I would not entirely support. After all, if you have a problem with people exceeding the speed limit, it's unlikely to be solved by reducing the speed limit still further. The behaviour which leads to these terrible accidents which we all want to stop is in itself already outside the law. And unless changes in the law are met with significant and well-advised changes in policing, then it would achieve little or nothing. We need to consider also the impact that this might have. And some of these arguments have already been rehearsed, but I will go over them so that my particular view on these are taken into account. Scotland is a country where at some times of the year it can actually be dark till as late as 10 o'clock in the morning and dark again not long after 3 in the afternoon. So any curfew designed to be applied to the hours of darkness simply would not work here. Over large areas of Scotland, not least the Highlands and Islands, the distances that individuals may choose to drive in order to attend education or employment can be exceptionally long, surprisingly so. And as such, it is difficult to see legislation which would not potentially impact on employment opportunities of young people who are willing to travel in order to work. The issues surrounding alcohol consumption also give me a little additional cause for concern, in that if we were to try to enforce a separate and different limit for young drivers, it may actually be very difficult to identify those who are likely to be exceeding that lower limit. And the situation may arise where the police have no alternative but to stop drivers at random in order to check that the combination of circumstances has not been breached. I'm concerned about anything that would lead to the police simply stopping cars randomly on our roads. Finally, on the issue of tuition, I believe that the Association of British Insurers have come up with a good idea. I don't believe that we should be able to sit a driving test or pass a driving test any younger than the 17 years that we have today. But I can see no harm in allowing drivers under instruction to drive at an earlier age. They suggest 16.5. I would go even further and allow them to drive from 16 on a provisional licence while under instruction, so guaranteeing that our young drivers have had a full year of instruction, or at least the opportunity to have that, before they sit a test. Finally, when it comes to insurance, I think there's opportunities there for the insurance industry to do a lot more to control the behaviour of young drivers. And I think there's much more that could be done with the installation of in-car devices, which actually assess the driving of an individual and can have the insurance adjusted. Certainly, if a device is there and it's capable of gauging the speed and the nature of a young driver's performance, it would be very easy to use these to identify those who are the problems. So with that said, I'm not against the principles set out in the Government's motion. However, these concerns are ones that I will be continuing to explore and find answers to.
Thank you very much. We now turn to the open debate. Speeches of 5 minutes, please. Stuart Stevenson, to be followed by Graham Pearson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And let me start by declaring my interest as a member of the Institute of Advanced Motorists. I first took my IAM test in 1972, and I took it again more recently in 2008. And the IAM's credo is that, as they put it, we passionately believe that our roads can be made a safer place by improving the standards of the people who use them. And I think that's a good place for this debate to be, and every contributor so far has sought to take us there. I'm delighted to see David Stewart here to join the debate. I know he's passionately in favour of improving standards on our roads, and I admire everything that he's done in his area. Let's just have a little look at the context. When I first passed my test in a car 51 years ago in 1963, a Mini Cooper S cost £777, had 70 brake horsepower and a top speed of 95 miles per hour. Today, a Mini Cooper S costs £21,000. That's almost exactly the same amount of money relative to average earnings. But it now has 184 brake horsepower and is capable of 143 miles per hour. So the test, simple and straightforward, that I passed in 1963 need not necessarily be the test that I should pass today to drive the much more powerful, much more potentially dangerous cars that we have. First car that I owned a share in was a 1928 Austin 7, top speed 28 miles per hour. Couldn't even break the town speed limit. It cost £5, by the way, complete with a spare engine. And, like Alec Johnson, I drove that around unlicensed, uninsured and off the public road, or at least that's what I'm telling you here. I started driving as a 12-year-old and acquired the skills very rapidly. But what I did not have was the experience to allow me to engage with what goes on the public highway. The Transport Research Laboratory work with over 100 countries, suggest quite a wide range of savings from GDL, as low as 2,200 casualties, as high as nearly 9,000. So there's more work needs to be done. They're suggesting 100 hours supervised over 12 months. Let me, as a private pilot, just compare that with flying. As a private pilot, I went solo after 12 hours instruction, and 40 hours instruction was necessary to get my licence. That didn't allow me to fly at night, didn't allow me to fly out of sight of the ground. You have to do training for complex equipment. You need 5 hours for a night rating, 15 hours for your instrument rating, further 5 hours for multi-engine. Graduated experience and training. Not allowed to carry passengers unless I've done 3 landings or takeoffs in the last 90 days, and I have a medical every year and an ECG every 2 years. Tightly regulated. I don't think people would want to fly with a pilot who wasn't performing to that kind of standard. By the way, you can start flying as a 12-year-old. So I think Alec Johnson's point about starting and driving at an earlier stage has some merit. It's worth considering, however, what kind of risks you're exposed to when you're flying. You very rarely are going to bump into another aircraft. There aren't actually all that many of them. In the UK, it would be an unusual occurrence for there to be more than 600 aircraft in the air at any one time in the whole of the UK. But on the roads, you're actually at 70 miles an hour each way in a dual carriageway. You're passing within feet at a closing speed of 140 miles an hour with other drivers whom you want to be well trained, who you want to be well equipped to deal with the conditions that they will take. Now, flying. Blood alcohol is 1/4 of what it is on the roads. And in addition, you are not allowed to fly until 8 hours after you've taken your last drink. There are some things in that we could look at in relation to flying. Let me just close my 5 minutes of contribution, Presiding Officer, by quoting Marilyn Monroe. If you can't handle me at my worst, then you don't deserve me at my best. I think that leads me to something for this debate. It's not about raising the standards of our best drivers can achieve. It's about raising the floor below which our least proficient drivers never fail. Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. I now call Graham Pearson to be followed by Claire Adamson.
I'm very grateful that I've been given a chance to contribute to this debate. I rise and support the Government motion and Mark Griffin's amendment to that motion. I have a fairly unique experience in this debate in being one of the young men who in his teenage years was a statistic, having had the success of crashing my parents' car in darkness on a country road and nearly seeing the end of me at an early stage. I have to say that probably there are many who had wished otherwise, that the outcome had been delivered. But I'm very grateful to have survived thanks to the support of the police and the accident emergency units on the night. When examining the balance to be struck between the freedom of the individual and the safety of young drivers, I think that we do well to remember the statistics. The OECD reported that road traffic accidents were the biggest killer of 15 to 24-year-olds in industrial countries. The driving age young people under 25 make up only 1/10 of the population in OECD countries, but represent more than 1/4 of car drivers killed on the road. There is a clear-cut conclusion there that young people are overrepresented in single-car and loss-of-control crashes, and crashes where drivers are turning across oncoming traffic. There is a duty on us to protect young drivers from their own inexperience and their own, as Alec Johnson indicated, overconfidence in their abilities to drive. In 1998, 17 to 21-year-olds accounted for 7% of the total driving population here, but they comprise 13% of the drivers involved in collisions. That statistic in itself is not only a reflection of tremendous angst caused within families through death on roads, but also serious injury. It reflects a loss of the talents and futures of these young people and a tremendous heartache held by families for years, decades and probably a lifetime in many respects. Certainly in my own case, it took over a year to recover fully from the accident that I was involved in, and I was very fortunate. But for other families that I grew up with, they were less fortunate, and parents in those circumstances and siblings carried the burden of that experience thereafter. Transport Scotland in 2011 made a number of recommendations which go alongside the issues debated today. The use of the Curriculum for Excellence in Ensuring learning opportunities in school is an important resource which we should commend to those in schools, and bear in mind not only those effects on young drivers, but also the effects that can happen from road accidents where pedestrians and cyclists are involved, and indeed car passengers. There's no doubt that passengers in vehicles with young drivers add to the compound, which encourages the kinds of behaviours which unfortunately result in accidents. And we should encourage better governance and evaluation of interventions to know what road safety education works with current young people, so that we invest in those interventions that are worthwhile. It would be churlish not to acknowledge the fall in the numbers of road accidents and deaths and injuries which have been occasioned in the last 5 years. But I'm heartened that the Minister shows no evidence of complacency. As was mentioned earlier, the Association of British Insurers have recommendations which they offer. Their minimum 12 months learning period seems a sensible way forward. The lowering of the driving age from 17 to 16.5 years, perhaps offered in order to please young people that they're not going to be deprived of driving but encouraged to drive well, again is a good balance. The lowering of the blood alcohol level too is important, although there's no mention of the impact of drugs and the effects on young drivers, particularly at night. And in a modern world, unfortunately, we need to think about that. The problem that Alec Johnson acknowledged about the difficulty of the different balances of blood alcohol level, I don't really think in a practical sense it has impact, because a police officer should not be thinking of doing a blood analysis or a breath analysis at the roadside unless there's a genuine level for suspecting that alcohol is involved.
Could you draw to a close, please?
So with that closing remark, I will leave it others to add to this debate, but I think it is an important one and one we should keep in mind. Thank you.
Many thanks. I call Claire Adamson to be followed by Tavish Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As the convener of the cross-party group on accident prevention and safety awareness, I'm particularly pleased to be called to speak in this important debate this afternoon. Indeed, the cross-party group held a November meeting on the theme of road safety, at which there were excellent presentations from a number of contributors, including George Keynes from Glasgow City Council, who talked about the Drive Safe and Go Safe Scotland initiative, which was emphasising that all communities and every one of us is responsible for road safety. We also had Robert Atkinson from the Healthy Working Lives and the Scottish Occupational Road Safety Alliance, talking particularly about the issue of occupational dangers, and which has already been mentioned in the Chamber this afternoon. And we know that 20 road deaths each year involve people at their work. There was also a presentation from a practitioner's point of view from Scottish Borders Council by Paul Richardson. And I think borders, like the North East and some of the other areas, have particular problems in their area because of the rural nature of the roads, and also tourists driving down there to take advantage of the rural roads. And they understand the problems associated with young drivers particularly well. And while I can understand the Government's frustration at the lack of progress towards a GDL from Westminster, Scotland has far from stood still in this issue, and I was delighted last week to hear that Scottish Borders are actually funding a 2-year programme which will allow 17 to 25-year-olds in those areas to get free advanced driver training, which I think is a really positive initiative. But the presentation I'd like to concentrate most is one that was given by ROSPA, by the Head of Road Safety, Kevin Clinton, and it was on the use of black box technology, which I think could be quite revolutionary in the context of a GDL. It's a really innovative way to increase young drivers' awareness. It helps parents and carers understand the driving practices of young people. It encourages young drivers to continually learn, to constantly monitor their progress and their driving abilities. And it has raised public awareness of what's actually there available to use technology in the area of driver technology. And the telematics that can be used are really quite advanced. And I don't think I understood until this presentation how sophisticated the opportunities are when black box technology can be used. It enables personal risk-taking to be calculated for every driver, and it highlights aspects of driving that could be improved. It enables an accurate analysis of the driver's behaviour, and it can incentivise people to improve because there's a constant feedback of the type of driving that people are undertaking. For young drivers, this can significantly reduce risky driving behaviours, especially among higher-risk young drivers. When the Scottish Government published the Transport Scotland National Debate on Young Drivers' Safety, it did examine and ask young people about their attitudes towards physically restricting what they can do under a GDL, and also the use of technology. And while the physical restriction of driving at night and the number of people in your vehicles was quite resisted, especially among, I would say, the male people who took part in the survey, there was actually quite a positive reaction to the use of technology by these young people. So while that's still a high-risk behaviour, obviously the fact that the monitoring was there when young people are undertaking that kind of high-risk driving may have a significant impact on their behaviour while doing so. So I was absolutely delighted that the Scottish Government have undertaken the Young Drivers at Work Black Box project with ROSPA, which looks specifically at young drivers in work. And it's unfortunate that the results of that are due to be published this Friday. It might have been helpful for this debate, but I'm certainly looking forward to the publication of that, because this involved using companies who are already involved in driver safety. People are involved in the management of occupational road risk, MORE, and H&S, the Health and Safety Executives. And these companies were approached to actually take part in the pilot. And what they found was that the driver safety score, trip scores, the constant feedback that they received improved the performance of the drivers. And when you understand that this technology can tell you about the pace of a driver, the calmness, the smoothness and their anticipation, these are really significant bits of information that are useful to employers and to young people. So I do hope that the black box technology will be considered under GDL. Thank you.
Many thanks. I call Tavish Scott to be followed by Gil Patterson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I, like Alec Johnson and Stuart Stevenson, learnt to drive at a young age off the public road, in my case in a farm setting, and I shared a lot of the analysis that they offered about the difference between the test that we sat and the one that my daughter sat 2 months ago when she passed. If there's something about the test still to this day that, in my view, needs to be changed, it is that we don't do enough real analysis and real training of different driving conditions in the modern test. I think we should put youngsters on skid pans with water all over them, because the first experience too many young drivers have, too many people who've passed the test have, when they hit ice or when they hit really wet conditions, is to slam on the brakes really hard. And if you've never done that before, that is a pretty scary experience. So there are parts of the existing driving test which, for me, still need a lot of work to equip the next generation with the ability to cope with a modern vehicle in the way in which other colleagues have described. I, like many members, have no doubt had the most awful of experiences. This was when I was still an elected member at home on the council, of going to a funeral of a young boy who lived in my island and was killed in a motor accident at all too young an age. And I will never forget the look on his parents that day, that dark day in Bressie, when he was buried. And that should give any of us across all the parties a very clear objective of tackling the number of deaths that has been highlighted this afternoon by the Minister and by others as to what does happen across the roads, not just in Scotland but right across the UK. I do, however, want to see practical proposals. I think it's all very well to set up an argument with Westminster. I understand the political need for the Minister to do that. After all, no debate at the moment is complete, sadly, without an attack on Westminster. But I think it's one thing to say you want something to happen and to demand a change in an approach, but it's another thing where you've got to actually propose what you want. And I may say I think that applies to the Labour Party as well, if they're just simply going to support this motion, because it says, and I quote in the last sentence, develop and take forward proposals on GDL without further delay. Well, you've got to say what that means. The TRL own research findings produced last year said overall effectiveness of GDL systems is linked to the number of components implemented, the strictness of those components and the conviction with which the system is implemented by authorities, which is all, I would have thought, a self-evident given. But therefore, I think for ministers or opposition parties to stand up and say we demand this GDL is implemented, but not say what measures they want in it, I think is pretty easy to do, but it's just not being fair to many people, including in all the campaigning organisations who make entirely reasonable observations about the need to see something better. I, for example, would be concerned by a complete ban on nighttime driving. The Minister cited, I think, Ireland in that context, or a zero policy on alcohol only affecting a certain category of driver. If you're going to have a zero policy on alcohol, I take Graham Pearson's point about police officers. I think it's got to be a zero policy on all drivers. And you might as well lump in mobile phones on that. This morning I got the airport bus in from Edinburgh Airport, and the number of white vans I saw drivers with the mobile phone at the ear, and he was steering, dare I say it, he was steering with one hand as well. We may have passed legislation in that area, hasn't made a blind bit of difference to most drivers' behaviour. So I think you need to be very clear about what you're trying to achieve and say it in a debate like this, rather than just do the usual thing of blaming everyone else. The other point that the Minister didn't mention in his motion, and Alec Johnston's amendment rightly picks this up, is in most of rural Scotland, there's either limited or no public transport. So there are a huge number of people who would be caught by whatever measures the Minister considers to be appropriate in that way. Let me just take nurses as an example. I found the government's own figures on nurses and midwives who would be caught by a restriction under the age of 25. There are 17 in Shetland, 75 in Dumfries and Galloway, 17 in Orkney, 105 in Ayrshire and Arran, 100 in Highland and 400 in Grampian. All nurses and midwives who we depend on every day in our hospitals and our health centres, who'd be caught if the kind of measures that have already been described in this debate were simply implemented without any thought to the consequences of how these essential public servants get to work. So let me just finish with, I thought Claire Addison made a very good point about black box technology. After all our young people now carry a mobile phone, a heck of a lot cleverer probably than the one I carry. It's always got location switched on, and they're very comfortable with that. So I thought Claire Addison made a good point about the reality of young people's attitude to a technology such as that, and possibly that being part of the solution, rather than just having airy ideas which have no detail behind them.
Thank you very much. And I call Gill Patterson to be followed by David Stewart.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. Can I start by making a declaration of interest? The business that I own, and it's now run by my son, we're suppliers to the accident damage industry. We supply throughout Scotland to workshops and body shops that repairs vehicles. Now that gives me over, I'm ashamed to say, 40 years, this young body here, of experience in that area. It was a daily call for me. It was calls all day, calling on body shops and repair shops. And it really is, no matter how many times you do it, it doesn't minimise the feeling when you see a car that's been damaged and there's been a young person involved in that accident. But when it comes to young people, for the best part, my experience tells me that they take great pride in their vehicles. The vehicles, by and large, are very well maintained. They've got great paint jobs, maybe a wee bit gaudy for my taste, except for the ties that I wear, which they would probably say are pot kettle black. But they use extremely flashy colours. They've got terrific wheels. I spend a lot of time looking at wheels, not just legs, I've got to tell you. And, they clearly take a great pride in what they've got. It's a great achievement to own a car and to drive a car, and it's a milestone in young people's lives. It's sometimes really hard to understand, from the experience I've got, that you go into a workshop and you see a vehicle that's completely wrecked, but people walk out of it alive. And then you see a car that's got very little damage on it at all. Turns out it's a fatality. Now, that goes for not just young people, I've got to say. That's just in general. So how does that happen? And the reason it happens is the car stops swiftly, maybe crashes into something, not a big bump, but the people inside the car collide with each other and they get head damage and fatalities. So looking at an accident, you can never tell what you're really looking at and what's really going to be the question that somebody brings to you. And when you walk in, you always get the bad story, I can assure you, when something that's happened, particularly if it's a woman or a young person. But of course, the stats speak for themselves, and members have already said, haven't they? This, young people aged between 17 and 25 make up 10% of licence holders, and yet they make up 23% of people involved in accidents. And more than 1 in 5 drivers involved in an injury accidents are aged between 25 and 24% of drivers involved are involved in fatal accidents. So that's a rather sad statistic. But I do like the idea that members have already said when it comes to the ABI Association of British Insurers, where they come up with the idea of a 12-month learning period. And I think that's a key factor, learning period and gaining some experience. And I think we very much want to take young people with us. I don't think we should give the idea that there's a penalty involved. And, coupled with that, the idea that we offset that in some way by reducing the time when your age goes from 17 to 16 and a half. I think that's a clear message that it's not a penalty that we're involved in. We're trying to engage with young people to give them the confidence and the experience that they need to keep themselves safe. And I'm sure that young people would buy into that. The other one that's extensively used by the insurance companies is the black box. And of course, the black box itself monitors behaviours like speed, turning, and the time in the car. And it also highlights good and bad habits. And it's just like having your mum sitting in the back seat, except it doesn't talk back. And it certainly reduces the accidents and it reduces the insurance costs. It encourages concentrations 24/7. And it certainly encourages safe driving. So I think it's quite possible and practical to bring this in for young drivers right across the board if we can come up with the technology. We've got the technology, but it's the cost of installing it. And if we had that, I think it would be more palatable for young people. And the last thing I would say is the young people I'm talking about are mainly males. Girls and women are far, far better when they're young and old. I know we employ a lot of people that drives vehicles. The women, by far, are the most careful drivers. They get into a lot less accidents and they get on with the job much, much better. But I think we're really looking at young males, and I think we owe it to them to look at this very carefully. And lastly, I think we've really got to take into account that people in rural settings, driving a car for young people can mean a job. And so whatever we come up with, we need to really take that into consideration before we make our final judgment on it. But it'll do one thing. If we do some of the things that's been suggested, it'll mean it'll be helping young people to stay safe.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid I have to say to the next two speakers that it's up to 5 minutes, please. David Stewart, to be followed by Graham Day.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I've been an advocate for the introduction of a form of graduate driving licence scheme for young and new drivers since early 2010. That was because after a double fatal road collision within the city of Inverness, I was contacted by bereaved parents. They pleaded with me to do anything I could do to try and address this carnage. And in response, Presiding Officer, I set up Sensible Driving, Always Arriving, a campaign that was supported by many local businesses in the Highlands and Islands. They sponsored a whole series of professionally developed DVDs which we put round every single school in the Highlands and Islands. We ran ads in the back of buses. We managed through McCrae Dix, a local garage, to have a sports car in new livery advertising the instincts around the issues of driver safety. We also visited schools and communities throughout the area. And very much the key philosophy in our campaign was the work of Dr. Sarah Jones, who's been referenced many times in this debate. And at the time, and I appreciate the statistics have changed, but at the time her stats showed that 22 young lives could be saved and £80 million saved to the Scottish economy. For me, Presiding Officer, this was a no-brainer, and it was a truism that's not depleted by repetition, that there's no greater tragedy, no greater sorrow, no greater loss for any parent than the death of a young son or daughter. So let me tell you more detail why I'm speaking this debate. In the early spring 2010, when I was approached by constituents to do something about road safety in Inverness, I met the Matheson family from Inverness. They had just lost their son Callum, who was 17, along with his friend, who was also 17, after being killed in a road collision within the city. And the accident statistics I quoted earlier to Alec Johnston are very stark. 1 in 5 newly qualified drivers crash within 6 months of attaining their licence. In a US study, it was showed that young people who are under 25, who have more than 3 passengers driving the weekend, are 5 times more likely to be involved in a crash. And 4 people per day are killed or seriously injured in road collisions involving young drivers on our roads each day in the UK. And as Alec Johnson suggested, there is also a rural component. Rural roads across Scotland are more likely to be the scene of a fatal or injury road collision than urban motorways or dual carriageways. And the Institute of Advanced Motoring lists 4 reasons why young male drivers are more likely to be involved in accidents we're talking about here today. Of course, as we'd all expect, inexperience and poor judgment in more difficult driving conditions. Inadequate control of the car, resulting in a single vehicle accidents, skidding, overturning or leaving the road. And over half of accidents involving drivers between 17 and 25 in Scotland occur when the drivers are making general progress the road, rather than performing particular manoeuvres, such as turning, changing lane or overtaking. But a third of collisions in rural areas occur when manoeuvring round bends. There's also attitudes and issues around lifestyle or attitudes, such as alcohol, drugs and peer pressure are particularly important, particularly in the context of social driving at night and the weekends. And the other issue, I think, is economic factors. Young drivers are more likely to have cheaper older cars, which offer them less protection from injury than newer vehicles, and are less likely to be fitted with technology, which reduces the risk of crashes occurring, such as differential braking, which reduces the loss of control at bends. In the 26th of October, I wrote to the Transport Minister, Stuart Stevenson, and I thank him for his kind comments earlier. And he said in answer to my question, and I quote, "The legislation for graduate driving licence scheme is a reserved matter, but in reply to the Driving Standards Agency consultation, we highlighted that there is strong support for regulated driving for young people amongst the road safety community." In this wind-up, perhaps the Minister could confirm that he would support a pilot GDL in Scotland and would write to the Department of Transport supporting this idea. And if he's looking for areas, I would certainly suggest the Highlands Downs may be one. So, in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I believe that GDL is an innovative idea whose time has come. And Tom Paine, an American revolutionary author, said, "We have it in our power to begin the world all over again." For families who've lost loved ones, unfortunately, we cannot turn the clock back. We can, however, adopt a new, safer, proven driving regime aimed at slashing the carnage on our roads and preventing the deaths and injuries of young drivers.
Many thanks. And I now call Graham Day.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Parliament has undoubtedly debated matters of greater significance than this one. I suspect we'll be lucky if this part of today's business secures more than a few paragraphs in our written press tomorrow. But particularly for those of us with children of an age where they're getting behind the wheel of a car, the issue of young driver safety is hugely significant, hugely important. My own son hasn't yet passed his driving test yet. Every time he goes out in a mate's car, he almost without exception leaves the house with a warning to take care ringing in his ears. It's not that his pals are risky drivers, as far as I know they aren't, but you cannot help but worry when you recall the mistakes you made as a young driver simply through lack of experience. And Stuart Stevenson was right in pointing out just how much more powerful modern cars have become. Nighttime driving, driving on rural roads, coping with winter conditions can each present different challenges, meeting which will only come through experience, as will developing an instinct for how other road users may behave. Yet 1 minute you aren't allowed out behind a steering wheel without an instructor or examiner by your side. The next you've got a piece of paper that says you've passed the test and off you go. Is it any wonder, as has already been mentioned, that Department of Transport statistics indicate that 1 in 5 new drivers crash within 6 months of receiving their full licence? The truth is, Presiding Officer, that in this regard we are selling our young people short, putting them at risk and, as parents, exposing ourselves to perhaps the most awful thing that can happen to us, the needless, avoidable loss of a child with the unimaginable anguish that leaves. I think as David Stewart illustrated earlier, it's a pain that does not go away when the child's pals get engaged, marry, have kids of their own. It just serves to remind the surviving family of what might, should have been. And as we've already heard, the consequences of tragic accidents of this nature aren't just confined to fatalities. Serious injury can also have long-term consequences. We also see the lives of those who may have caused fatalities by their driving pay the price for years to come, as Mark Griffin highlighted. Presiding officer, a few weeks ago, a family friend got the call all parents of young people dread. The police were on the other end of the phone advising that her youngest son had been involved in an accident. She arrived at the scene to find, thankfully, he had survived a horrific barrel-rolling crash with just cuts and bruises. Ironically, I understand, because the vehicle he'd been a passenger in lacked a front seat belt and he'd been thrown from it. A very lucky young man and mightily relieved mother. And I think that reminds us that this isn't just the young drivers themselves who can be at risk from their inexperience. There's the passengers they're carrying, not to mention other road users. Across the whole of the UK, it's estimated that introducing a GDL system for 17 to 19-year-olds could prevent approaching 4,500 casualties annually. A Cardiff University study based on accident figures between 2000 and 2008 suggests that introducing even a limited form of GDL involving restricting driving between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. and passenger carrying of 15 to 24-year-olds to just one, even if it secured even 50% compliance, could prevent 6 deaths, 51 serious and 250 minor injuries in Scotland. And we've heard today the latest figure of saved lives could be as high as 19. Statistics show that a young driver with 3 or more passengers in the car is 4 times more likely to be involved in a crash. This surely has to be something worth looking at. I note some of the points made by Alec Johnson regarding the hours of darkness and travel to education or work in remote rural areas. And I recognise that setting up such a system could not be without challenges. Common sense exemptions would have to be considered to allow for work situations and perhaps giving lifts to family members. But the principle here is undoubtedly sound and reflective of practice in a number of countries around the globe. I also note the suggestion from the Association of British Insurers that introducing GDL, albeit a strict version of it, could lead to a 15 to 20% drop in premiums for young people. To my mind, that potentially makes GDL a win-win, saving lives and the devastation of families and rewarding young drivers financially. I would urge Parliament tonight to support the motion and the Labour amendment.
Many thanks. We now turn to the closing speeches and a call on Alex Johnston. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think this has been an extremely interesting and high-quality debate in which we have had a range of ideas and some quite original ideas brought forward. But the key problem at the heart of this remains the same. And as I was making some notes for what I was going to say in my closing remarks, I found myself with a very clear idea in my head, and one which I hope you will come with me on. Because in this year in which we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the First World War, we've seen a lot of television programmes looking at the history of that period. And for us, 100 years on, we find it very difficult to understand how our young men in such huge numbers would volunteer to go off to a war with a gun over their shoulders. But the reason for that is a simple one, and it is, of course, we all know, that young men believe deep down that nothing can harm them. They believe that they can do anything and they will survive. We know only too well that that's not the case. And while our young men no longer go off to war, when they get behind the wheel of the car, it's quite often that same deep-seated emotion that takes control of them. And we do mean young men because so often it is young men who have the steering wheel in their hand when these accidents happen. But it's also young women because so often there are young women in the cars also injured or killed as a result of these accidents. So it's no respecter of gender, this problem. There was a very good speech by Tavish Scott during this debate, which I agreed with almost 100%. But there was one issue in which I would vary slightly with him, and that is when he talked about the potential for introducing more significantly difficult levels of testing. Now, I believe that we should test our young drivers to ensure that they are absolutely at their best. But the problem I perceive is that no level of testing will ever identify those who are at greatest risk. because it is those who are at greatest risk who are the most confident, the most able, and the ones who are most likely to pass any test we put before them.
Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you. Would the member consider that perhaps you should not be able to take your test until your instructor says you are sufficiently trained to do it? That is certainly the case in aviation, and it seems to work there.
Alex Johnson.
Indeed, I believe that is an appropriate way to go forward. But again, I would re-emphasise that the testing process appears incapable of identifying those young drivers who are at most risk of getting involved in accidents of this type, because it is the most confident, the most able, and those who are have the greatest ability to pass any test we put in front of them that will be the ones who eventually overstretch themselves and find themselves involved in such an accident. That's why education must always have a place. And we can start that education early with our young people, long before we even begin the driving training process. It is something of a disappointment that the efforts that went on between the councils and the police force in the North East over recent years appears not to have found favour with Scotland's National Police Force now that there has been a reorganisation. Because the work that was done between the councils and the police force in the North East schools did go a long way to explaining to individuals the risks that they would face as young drivers, particularly in the peculiar North East environment, where the roads do invite young drivers to exceed the speed limit and then throw them off the road at the first corner, it would appear. Moving on to the final issue that's been raised frequently in this debate, the issue of driver training and young driver assessment is something in which I think we've found a significant degree of agreement here today. The idea that we allow drivers to begin their training younger than the age of 17 is something which I think has found favour in every corner of the chamber. I think it's vital that we ensure that long periods of training take place, and if we're going to allow our young drivers to drive at 17, they should have a significant level and time of training behind them. And the idea of allowing drivers to drive under instruction on the public road at 16.5 or even 16 is something which I believe will find a great deal of favour. When I spoke earlier, I mentioned what I described as in-car devices and have been mentioned by other people during the debate as black boxes. I think it was Claire Adamson that first brought in that phrase. But there is a level of technology which will allow us to assess the performance of young drivers, to allow that to be demonstrated if they take any risks, and, as was pointed out by another speaker, the opportunity to reduce insurance costs by those who can demonstrate their own ability. So I think this has been a constructive debate. There's much that I can support, and I look forward to decision time.
Many thanks. I call on James Kelly. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to close this afternoon's debate supporting the Labour amendment, also the government motion, but sorry to disappoint Alex Johnson not supporting the Conservative amendment. I think that this has been a high-quality debate. There's been a lot of good experiences, and a lot of members have brought their own experience, not only as drivers, but as Gil Patterson has done in his professional capacity, have brought that to debate to make it a very informative one indeed. Many have quoted the statistics in relation to young drivers, and I think those statistics are the starting point of the debate, with young drivers forming 10% of the driving population, but 20% forming 20% of the accidents. And indeed, as many have pointed out, in the first 6 months, 27% of young drivers involved accidents. It's clear that there's a real issue. But it's not only the statistics, it's the human story behind the statistics. As both David Stewart and Graham Day eloquently pointed out in their contributions. It's the human tragedy behind those statistics. It's the families who have lost young men, and in some cases young women who may have been passengers in the car. It's the families left behind. It's a loss of life. or even in some cases people badly injured whose life is never the same again. So that paints the picture of the challenge that we face, and therefore I think that the challenge for politicians is, what do we do about it? What can we do about it? And from that point of view, the GDL scheme is one worthy of looking at. I think if you look at the Sarah Jones research, there's no doubt that it does not only save lives, but it would save money across the Scottish and UK government budget lines, as people would be more wouldn't be involved in accidents and therefore more capable of contributing to the economy, and there wouldn't be such a strain on the health service. I think obviously there are different issues that have to be assessed there. I would say to Tavish Scott, clearly we are disappointed that the government have not brought forward the Green Paper, and I think the Green Paper is the opportunity to develop these proposals and to look at issues, like, are we going to limit, the alcohol blood levels? Are we going to assess issues like, hands-free driving in relation to mobiles, and other issues that members have raised in the debate? I think the Green Paper would be an opportunity to develop these proposals, to test the arguments, and from that you look at the evidence, and ultimately it's the evidence that drives forward and informs any proposals that you bring forward. But I think ultimately where we are is that I don't think we're in a position to do nothing on this issue. We need action, and we need action not only from the UK government, but also the Scottish Government where they have areas of responsibility. Mark Griffin raised the issue of education, and I know the Minister said he would touch on that in his summing up. I think as a number of people have said in their contributions, we need to make the best use of police resources and target the policing appropriately. I think there's also more can be done in terms of discussions between the Scottish Government and councils on this issue. Claire Adamson quoted the example of Borders Council and providing free advanced driving lessons for young drivers, and that's something that that's an example where the Scottish Government can work with local councils in terms of giving examples of good practice. I think there's been a number of interesting contributions to the debate. Stuart Stevenson was very correct when he pointed out that it's really about making sure that our young drivers are more capable. And I think the point that Tavish Scott made about the driving test showed that. One of my memories of when I passed my driving test is that there's a big gap between going round with the driving instructor where he's telling you to go from A to B, and then all of a sudden you're sitting in the car on your own. And my experience was I was driving to Kilmarnock for a football match, and what do I do now? And a lot of young drivers must just sadly find that overwhelming, and I think that's why we see the accidents that we do. And that therefore ties into the point that Gil Patterson and others have made about lengthening the time that young drivers have got to learn. I think if we reduced the age to 16.5, but said that they've got to learn for 12 months, then they would be much more capable, as Stuart Stephen has pointed out, by the time it comes round to passing their test and then emerging onto the road. So in summing up, Deputy Presiding Officer, I think it's been a very constructive debate, and people have made their contributions in a constructive manner, even when we've not always agreed. I think there are important issues for the UK Government to consider in relation to the Green Paper. I think there are some practical measures that the Scottish Government working with local councils can take, and I look forward to the Minister's response.
Many thanks. And I now call on Keith Brown to wind up the debate in around 8 minutes. Please, Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would start by agreeing with James Kelly. I think it's been in general a very constructive debate with a high quality of contributions, and I'll try and, if I can, refer to those contributions in my closing remarks. First of all, to say I think Mark Griffin raised a number of issues to do with education in particular, and just to say that we have a number of education campaigns, one of which was Kids in the Car, which, once again, whenever you launch these public marketing campaigns, can leave yourself open to a bit of fun being poked at you. But the idea behind that was that, just as Alec Johnson had said, that actually people start learning about driving from an early age. They actually start learning about driving the minute they go into a car, whatever age they are. They start to take on board, not least sometimes some of the habits of their parents, and that was the point behind that campaign. We also have a Safe Road User Award, which is available within the SQA suite of courses, which can be accessed by approved centres. And we also have the Young Driver initiatives such as Cut It Out in Strathclyde or Driving Ambition in Grampian. And we've heard about Dave Stewart's initiative as well. And I think, like Stuart Stevenson, I want to recognise the work that Dave Stewart has done now over a number of years in this area. We also have a number of other initiatives. Crash Magnets is a road safety education resource designed specifically for use with 14 to 7-year-olds in S3 to S6. I think the other point that Mark Griffin asked was about Police Scotland. I think whatever has been said about Police Scotland, there was some fairly strong remarks, I think, from Alec Johnson about road policing in particular. I think the Trunk Roads Policing Unit within Police Scotland now, I think, is an extremely good resource and a real focus being brought to bear on these issues, and it's certainly not the case it's left in any instance to cameras to do the work for the police, although, of course, the cameras are a form of policing in some sense in their own right. So there are these campaigns going on. I think the interesting point that Mark Griffith raised in relation to rehabilitation, if he doesn't mind, I will go away and look at that. And I don't think there is an initiative just now within the prison service for the particular types of offences which have been referred to, although there are some courses, I think, which can be done post a custodial sentence. But I will look at that. I think it's a good point to have raised. Stuart Stevenson mentioned his Austin 7, which had a top speed of 28 miles an hour, and also mentioned Marilyn Monroe. The only thing I can think that Stuart Stevenson has in common with Marilyn Monroe is the alliterative name that he has. But I would say that my first car was a Wolseley 1660. Which, and this may surprise somebody like Mark Griffin, being of his age, but this car actually had a starting handle on it, and I'm not that old, but it had a starting handle which you used at the front of the car. Didn't have to use it, only if it didn't work on the key. And I can honestly say I never crashed it, but that's because it would take a year and a half to get from 0 to 60, I think. So I think that underlines the point which I think Stuart Stevenson made about the way that technology has developed and how cars have become much more powerful. Claire Stewart mentioned, as did a number of other members, the issue of black box technology, or telematics as it's often called. And I think it's worth saying that there is a great deal of merit in that. I think it does tend to be more relevant where it's the case that the young person owns the vehicle themselves. It's much more difficult sometimes if it's owned by somebody else, which can be the case. And also, just as there has been some resistance, as some members have mentioned, to some of the proposals within a GDL scheme, there's also resistance to the idea of mentoring or monitoring young people in that regard as well. But we do believe it is an interesting initiative, and it's one that has been brought up by both motoring organisations and by insurance providers as well, and we are keeping an eye on that because we think it has some real potential. If I can mention perhaps the most discordant speech, which was Tavish Scott's speech, got in fact increasingly angry, I think, as he went on. And one point he made was that this was a device to try and further the constitutional argument, having a go at Westminster. Well, we didn't start from that position. We started from the position in broad agreement with the Westminster Government. We had correspondence with them, which we didn't make a big issue of, and eventually the Westminster Government agreed to go ahead with its Green Paper. They then changed their position. And all we're doing is highlighting that fact and saying, if you don't want to go ahead with this, we think it's worth considering further, and we would want to take it further either by you passing the powers to us or doing something yourself. I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to say, and I think it was perhaps the poverty of Tavish Scott's other arguments that led him to try and use the constitutional debate to try and hide that fact, and hopefully we'll take away the crutch of that constitutional debate on the 19th of September, and we'll concentrate on the merits of these arguments. And the other point that was made, which I think James Kelly dealt with very well, which was to say, Tavish Scott said, well, you should have your proposals, which you then discuss. Well, that's the point of the Green Paper. Consider, consult, and then commit yourself. I think that's a proper way to do these things. Yes, I will.
Tavish Scott.
The constructive way the Minister is behaving. Would he like to explain why his white paper, which is paid for by the taxpayer, didn't include all these measures that he's talking about today?
Minister.
Yeah, if he'd been following the debate, he'd realise that since we published the white paper, and the point of publishing the white paper, we had an agreement with the UK government that they would go ahead with their green paper. They didn't do that. The circumstances have changed. So I think that nearly every other contribution to this debate was relatively constructive, apart from those examples which I've just mentioned. I think it's also true to say, as some people have said, that we have to look at not just the drivers themselves, but the others that are in the car. And a number of people have mentioned, their offspring, and said, well, it's not just I have two sons, both of 17 and 19, will drive, but also my daughter, when going out with other people. That's the concern, I think, as a parent that you tend to have. There's a person that's going to be driving the car. If it's another young person going to be susceptible to some of the pressures, peer pressure or other pressures, and is my child going into that car going to be vulnerable? I think that's a very legitimate concern which parents have. And I think that points us to some of the things which might feature in a graduated driving licence. Dave Stewart made the mention of the idea of a pilot. Now, of course, as things currently stand, we'd have to have permission to undertake that pilot. I do think, off the top of my head, there may be issues with that logistically, from constraining it within one geographical area. There could be issues with that, but I would undertake to go and look at that and see if there's a possibility there. Of course, it would be the responsibility, as things stand, for the UK Government through the DVLA to allow us to do that. If it changes in September, then, of course, with the DVLA changes that we propose, perhaps we could do that. But I think there is perhaps an idea there. It might be defeated by the logistics, but let's take that away. Interestingly, Dave Stewart also mentioned Tom Paine, perhaps whose most famous book is The Rights of Man. And I think some of this does come down to the rights, inevitably, of individuals, whether it's right to constrain those rights, not just because to protect them from themselves, which is a dangerous area to get into, constrain somebody's rights to protect them from themselves. But I think we do have a very legitimate point to make, as I just tried to make in relation to passengers, but other road users as well. If you are in a car and you don't treat it in the way that it should be treated, and you can very easily cause the death or injury of somebody else. And I think that makes it a legitimate role for the government to be involved in, to see what we can do to try and mitigate what a number of members have mentioned as being absolutely tragic and very heart-rending circumstances when parents of a child involved in a car accident are informed of that. The evidence is the way to go forward on this. So we'll get the evidence first of all. It clearly shows that graduated driver's licensing represents a strong opportunity to make a genuine difference to road safety for young and novice drivers. As I explained, I have pressed UK ministers to consider taking forward proposals on GDL, and also offered to work with them in a constructive way in order to achieve that. Unfortunately, as I say, it now appears not just that it's been postponed, the Green Paper, but there's no prospect of positive action coming from the UK Secretary of State for Transport on this issue in the foreseeable future, and that is their right to say that. All I would say is if they don't want to act, then please allow us to have the power so we can take forward, first of all, a consultative process to find out what kind of scheme would be beneficial for Scotland. And set against the background of avoidable road casualties, coupled with an overwhelming supporting evidence base in favour of GDL, this is very frustrating, and the reason why I've sought this debate today. So I would conclude by thanking first of all the contributions that we've received from different members. I would offer a further reference from the recent evidence review commissioned by DFT, and that review estimated, this figure has been mentioned already but worth repeating, that a GDL system in the UK would result in annual savings of 4,471 casualties, annual savings, and £224 million. And neither the human cost nor the suffering or the economics add up to any reason for us to ignore the possibilities of a GDL. I urge members to support the motion.
Thank you very much. And that concludes the debate on young and novice drivers and graduated driver licensing. And it's now time to move on to the next item of business. Which is a debate on motion number 9446 in the name of Michael Matheson on the immunisation programme. And I would invite all of those members who wish to speak in this debate to press the request to speak buttons now, please. And I call on Michael Matheson to speak to and move the motion. Minister, 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm pleased to be able to open this debate about Scotland's immunisation programme. The World Health Organization has stated that the 2 public health interventions that have had the greatest impact on world health are clean water and vaccines. Immunisation is one of the most effective ways of protecting the public against serious disease and of reducing the spread of serious disease. The development of effective vaccines in the last few decades has led to huge declines in the number of deaths from various diseases, particularly in childhood. Before the introduction of the National Vaccination Programme, Scotland's children were extremely vulnerable to diseases such as whooping cough, polio and measles. Indeed, the Scottish Routine Childhood Immunisation Programme is one of the cornerstones of our efforts to improve and to protect public health. Infants in Scotland are vaccinated against a wide range of diseases which once posed a serious danger to life, but which are now condemned to the past. The programme has also dramatically reduced the incidence of once common diseases such as tetanus, whooping cough, measles, mumps and rubella. The value of the immunisation programme is very clear. For example, vaccinations against measles was introduced in 1968. In 1970, there were more than 25,000 confirmed cases of measles in Scotland. By 1994, that had fallen to 536 confirmed cases. And by 2012, that had declined further to just 28 confirmed cases. Through the immunisation programme, we have also offered important protection against conditions such as meningitis. Since 1999, children in Scotland have been able to be vaccinated against meningitis C as part of the routine childhood immunisation programme. When the vaccine was introduced, there were 95 cases of meningitis C in Scotland. Between 2008 and 2012, there were only 2 cases of meningitis C. While we have seen the effects of immunisation on children against meningitis C, meningitis B remains a great threat. A vaccine against meningitis B became licensed for use last year, and the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation has just recommended its introduction here in Scotland and across the rest of the UK. This, Presiding Officer, is a major step forward in our ability to further protect children from the threat of meningitis, and I am sure all members will welcome the decision to have the vaccination introduced in the near future. The importance of these childhood immunisation programmes is clearly recognised by the public, and Scotland has an enviable high uptake rate. For the last decade, in Scotland we have had uptake rates of between 96 and 98% for children completing the vaccination course for diphtheria, tetanus whooping cough, polio and other conditions, including meningococcal group C and pneumococcal conjugate vaccine for the 24 months of age, consistently above the 95% target recommended by the World Health Organization. Uptake figures for other vaccination schedules, including MMR and the PCV booster vaccine, are continuing to rise too, and both are well above 90%. This year, uptake rate for MMR reached its 95% target. Nevertheless, we cannot afford to be complacent. In 2013, Wales and England experienced a large outbreak of measles, a disease that has been targeted by the World Health Organization for European elimination by 2015. Unfortunately, MMR vaccine uptake declined to less than 80% in Wales and England after the now discredited Wakefield study, and this resulted in an increased population susceptibility to measles. In Scotland, MMR vaccine uptake dropped to 87% in 2003. Scottish public health effort, in response to this decline, aimed to maximise uptake of MMR1 by 2 years, ensuring at least 95% uptake of 1 dose of MMR before starting school at age 5, and then maximising uptake of the second dose of MMR by age 6. The most recent Scottish MMR uptake rate for December 2013 shows that 96% uptake for MMR and almost 92% for MMR2. Overall, measles have been well controlled in Scotland, with only small sporadic cases occurring across the country during the course of 2013. As uptake rates did not fall to as sharply in Scotland as they did elsewhere in the UK following the Wakefield study, the effects of last year's outbreak in Scotland was not as severe as was the case in England and Wales. Nevertheless, the children who were most susceptible to this particular outbreak were those who would have otherwise been vaccinated in the late 1990s. And it was for that reason that a short MMR vaccination catch-up programme was put in place to protect those children who were not vaccinated originally. Presiding Officer, this outbreak was an important reminder of the value of vaccination programmes and the speed with which a disease can spread if we do not remain vigilant. Another long-running childhood immunisation programme, which is delivering positive public health benefits, is the HPV vaccination offered to girls at S2. This programme protects girls against 2 types of HPV that cause approximately 70% of cervical cancer and 2 other types of HPV that cause some 90% of cases of genital warts. Since its introduction in September 2008, we have seen a consistently high uptake of this particular vaccination programme. And while we are only now seeing the results of the programme, research will be published soon in the British Journal of Cancer, which will show that these high uptake rates have already led to a reduction in the prevalence of these types of HPV in young women. And I'll give way to Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful to the Minister. There are indeed high uptake rates, and I think we can be confident that there will be success in preventing instances of cervical cancer. But of course, HPV is implicated in a number of other cancers, oropharyngeal, penile and anal cancers. And in particular, young men who have sex with men don't benefit from the herd immunity argument that young heterosexual men would benefit from. Is the government taking active consideration to the extension of the HPV vaccine to boys and young men, and when can we expect to hear some progress on that?
So the member may be aware that the advice which governments receive on the use of vaccination programmes comes from the Joint Vaccination Immunisation Committee. This is an issue which they have given some consideration to, and given some of the emerging data and information in this matter, they have set up a specialist subgroup in order to explore this issue further. Once that subgroup has reported to the committee and they have then submitted their report to government, we will then be in a position to make an informed decision about that. But I think at this point we should allow that expert group to consider the existing body of evidence and then to evaluate how that can then be effectively taken forward if the recommendation is that there should be changes to the HPV vaccination programme. So I don't have a time frame that I can give the member, but what I can give him an assurance of is that that process is already in place to carry out the evaluation that the member is making reference to. It's not only in childhood where we have seen the value of immunisation. Since 2011, the seasonal influenza vaccination programme has offered protection to over 65s and those in at-risk groups. Consistently strong uptake rates since the introduction of the programme have seen the number of deaths attributable to flu having almost halved, and that there are 2,000 fewer annual hospitalisations caused by flu, and the number of GP consultations has also fallen by a quarter. Building on the success of the seasonal influenza programme, we have embarked on one of the most ambitious extensions to the immunisation programme. We know that children are vulnerable to the flu, and so by extending the influenza programme to all children between the ages of 2 and 17, we will be able to offer important protection to those who are vaccinated. This is a significant undertaking, and the programme will be phased in over a number of years. As well as protecting the children who are immunised, we also see that there will be benefits from this particular programme extending into the population more generally, with yet further reductions in the number of deaths each year caused by influenza and in the number of hospitalisations and GP consultations that take place as a result. Presiding Officer, in the last year we have seen an unprecedented expansion of the immunisation programme, with 3 new programmes alone in the last year. For example, we have successfully implemented the vaccination programme against rotavirus, a disease that causes around 1,200 babies to be hospitalised each year, alongside the introduction of the shingles vaccine and the childhood flu vaccination programme. We have seen these programmes being introduced in a way which I believe allow the public to be assured about the ability to deliver major immunisation programmes in Scotland. For example, in the shingles programme, around 7,000 cases of shingles are recorded each year in people who are 70 years old. Since September 2013, those aged 70 years will be offered vaccination against shingles, protecting them against what is, and at times can be, a long-term condition that can result in pain and discomfort.
As you draw to a close.
The positive benefits that I have outlined in the immunisation programme, Presiding Officer, are a reflection of the professionalism and the expertise within NHS Scotland. None of this could have happened without the contribution of GP practices, school nurses, NHS boards, Health Protection Scotland and other public agencies throughout the country working together to make sure that Scotland's vaccination programme functions successfully.
Thanks. Now call on Dr Richard Simpson to speak to and move Amendment 9446.1. Dr Simpson, 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. There are now 14 routine vaccines throughout life from 2 months old to over 70, and of course the meningitis B vaccine is coming along. And despite periodic concerns about safety, immunisation, both routine and additionally for travel, is one of medicine's greatest success stories. Some of the recent additions, like shingles and rotavirus, are quickly finding their place. Rotavirus actually kills more than 600,000 children worldwide each year. In the UK, our wealth allows us to vaccinate more to prevent admissions than death. But in sub-Saharan Africa, when combined with bad water and poor sanitation, rotavirus can be fatal. All new vaccines, like the human papillovirus or HPV vaccine, have their critics, and these new vaccines should be carefully monitored as they enter the mass market. Internationally, smallpox has now been completely eradicated. That was the first ever vaccine introduced by Jenner in 1796. Polio has been reduced to a few areas, but through ignorance and prejudice in North Pakistan, health workers are being murdered when trying to deliver this vaccine. And we should, I think, use this debate to send a message from our Parliament to support and encourage these courageous health workers who are risking their lives on a daily basis. Measles cases have been reduced by 74% worldwide, and the Global Vaccine Action Plan, GVAP, now signed up to by 200 countries, is a roadmap for extending the delivery of a basic package of vaccine. But, colleagues, the estimates are that there are still 1.5 million children dying each year, 1 every 20 seconds, from vaccine-preventable diseases. So it is a challenge to extend vaccines to the poorest countries. Big pharmaceutical companies are beginning to address this issue, both with novel funding approaches and with research into vaccines for diseases which are prevalent internationally. For example, malaria is thought to cause between 1 and 3 million deaths annually, but there is now a vaccine in development which will hopefully curbed the re-emergence of malaria, which was previously being reduced. The biggest vaccine story for the United Kingdom and the Western developed world in the at the beginning of this century and the end of the last century was, as the Minister has referred to, around the MMR vaccine. And the consequences of this should not be lost on those politicians who supported the Wakefield fraud. It would have been bad enough had this fraud been the first time that a single scientist had created a storm around a vaccine, but it was not. In the 1980s, Dr. McFarlane raised concerns about whooping cough vaccine, and the resultant drop in intake, encouraged by the media, caused a regeneration of whooping cough. Young children were damaged. No proof of the pertussis vaccine being a problem was ever established, and the campaign petered out. The autism link story, created out of bad, unethical research, cruelly misled parents into abandoning the MMR. Now, opposition politicians supported the single vaccine, and that was despite expert opinion and the evidence from Japan that these vaccines were not effective. I was personally vilified in this chamber and in the press over my firm support for the triple vaccine. And some politicians berated the Labour government for following the advice of all the Royal Colleges at the time. The result, colleagues, was shown in the French and Welsh outbreaks in measles in the last year. And I still feel that the Scottish response to the Welsh outbreak, which did come on top of a significant one in France, and had the EU calling for a significant programme of catch-up, I believe our response was rather complacent and rather slow. There was no national urgency. There was no national advertising campaign to update those who had missed out on the MMR vaccine. There was letters sent to the parents where the vaccine was not administered. But I believe without that national campaign, we are still at risk. There was no campaign in the colleges or universities where the increase in mumps has occurred, again as a result of that MMR scandal. Now, there are two new vaccines, and meningitis B, which is now to be made available following the announcement last week by the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation. And there is also HPV, which in a new form, which covers 9 valencies, may be made available and, as Patrick Harvey has suggested, could be extended to boys. The influenza vaccine will be administered intranasally to young children, which, along with the shingles and rotavirus, should all be monitored to see what actually happens when, in practice, it's put into the mass market. Flu immunisation is actually very important, and we did have, I think, a good preparation for the pandemic. I made my own contribution with my report in 2001 on this, and I did recommend we should stockpile Tamiflu at the time. But, colleagues, I have to say, and to say to the Minister, that the Tamiflu has been the subject of much debate as to how effective it actually is. And this is partly because of the failure by Roche to publish all the research timeously. So I know there's a big increase in the immunisation budget next year, and I assume that is partly due to the new immunisations that are coming in. But when we review the pandemic, the effects of the swine flu pandemic, which was fortunately not a very serious one, I hope that in considering the pandemic programme for future, we will look at that again and make some decisions about whether we should restock with Tamiflu. The evidence of pressures, which we mentioned in our motion, I think is important. This is based on the NHS Scotland staff survey, which revealed that only a third of nurses and midwives say they can meet all the conflicting demands in their time at work, and a quarter thinks there's enough staff for them to do their job properly. I've been told midwives have refused to administer vaccines recommended for pregnant women. This is opportunistic vaccine, which is important, and they should be required to administer that vaccine. Whooping cough in pregnancy and MMR before leaving hospital in particular. Are these practices even being monitored? Now, new vaccines are being introduced with new pressures on staff. Health visitors play an important role in supporting, if not giving the vaccines, in supporting parents through an increasingly complex child vaccine programme. But the number of health visitors is determined by individual health boards, and our recent FOI inquiry showed this to be inadequate. In conclusion, Deputy Presiding Officer, the combination of new vaccines, demands of family nurse partnership and now the named person for every child means the Government must demonstrate in June, when they publish their workforce plans, a degree of leadership over health visitors. Scotland has done very well with our immunisation programme, and I move the amendment in my name.
Many thanks. Now call on Dr Nanette Milne to speak to and move Amendment 9446.2. Dr Milne, 5 minutes, please.
This is a welcome and timely debate, just a month before this year's World Immunisation Week and a few days after the recommendation by the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation that, as we know, the meningitis B vaccine should be introduced into the childhood immunisation programme. I think we sometimes forget just how valuable immunisation has been throughout the world in eradicating or significantly reducing the incidence of diseases which used to be commonplace, leading to complications and death in people right across the globe. We no longer fear smallpox, and we can travel safely in places where tropical diseases are rife, thanks to the many vaccines which have been developed over the years to give protection from them. I well remember a student visit I made to Yugoslavia in the 1960s as part of a public health tour, when I saw several cases of tetanus, where the virus had entered the body through roughened skin on heels in contact with earth's tracks. At the time, I had a few painful hacks on my own heels, and I was very thankful for the tetanus vaccination I'd had prior to setting out on my travels, because tetanus is not a pleasant disease to see. I also recall that I had to have a typhoid vaccination before entering Yugoslavia on that occasion to ensure that I wasn't a carrier, because we'd just had a significant outbreak of the disease in Aberdeen as the result of a contaminated batch of corned beef. Closer to home, I can still vividly recall the very painful photophobia I experienced while suffering from measles as a child. And my husband had an iron lung on standby for him when he contracted polio during the UK outbreak shortly after the end of World War II. Fortunately, he had no lasting effects of the disease, nor did I suffer the serious complications of measles. But we were lucky, and it concerns me that there have been several cases of measles in Scotland recently and outbreaks of whooping cough, indicating the continuing need to maintain high levels of immunisation in childhood, which unfortunately were adversely affected by the MMR scare a few years ago. To be able to protect the population from the damage caused by common infections like rubella, and from the long-term effects of the human papillomavirus leading to cervical cancer, and increasingly recognised as a causative factor in other malignancies such as oropharyngeal and other cancers. It's an enormous benefit resulting from many years of valuable research. And each year we're hearing of further vaccines being developed, which could in due course eliminate many scourges of modern-day society. The introduction of meningitis B vaccine into the childhood immunisation programme, as recommended by the JCVI, is a case in point, because meningitis B is now the commonest form of the disease in the UK, accounting for 90% of meningococcal infections, following the success of the meningitis C vaccination campaign in all but eliminating that form of disease, with only 2 cases of serogroup C reported in Scotland since 2007. Meningitis B is a devastating illness, with babies under a year old particularly at risk. It can kill within 24 hours of initial symptoms, and indeed it does kill 10% of those affected, with a third of the survivors suffering lifelong consequences. So the recommendation to include the Men B vaccine in the immunisation programme for babies is very much to be welcomed, as is the Scottish Government's stated intention to work with health departments across the UK to ensure its speedy inclusion in the immunisation programme. We all know the benefits of the influenza vaccine in keeping vulnerable people safe from its complications like pneumonia and respiratory failure. And many elderly and immunosuppressed people are alive today as a result of the annual vaccination programme in Scotland, with many also benefiting from the pneumococcal vaccine, where one application will give lifelong protection from the pneumonia caused by that organism. So the extension of the flu vaccination to children is an important development, as, of course, is the vaccination against rotavirus. I also very much welcome the herpes zoster vaccine referred to in Labour's amendment, having seen the painful and debilitating effect of this virus, particularly in susceptible elderly people. Shingles was the trigger leading to my mother's death in her 80s. She lived for a year after developing the illness, but it led to her steady decline both physically and mentally, and she never regained the quality of life she had before being hit by that virus. Presiding Officer, there are many other vaccines we could discuss, both available today and in the pipeline, but of course time doesn't allow for that in a short debate. Suffice to say that I wholeheartedly support the motion, which articulates the clear benefits and crucial importance of immunisation programmes to our public health. And I am encouraged that the annual uptake for childhood vaccination is as high as 97%. We can't be complacent, however, because it is extremely important that this high level of uptake is maintained to protect the community. And it follows that we must support health boards and primary care staff in particular to maintain their commitment to immunisation, despite the pressures that this will put on their workforce, as highlighted in Richard Simpson's amendment. Because we will undoubtedly see more and more life-saving vaccines coming on stream as a result of cutting-edge research being carried out in the UK and elsewhere. I move to the amendment in my name. Thank you.
Excellent. Many thanks. We now move to the open debate, and I call on Dr Aileen MacLeod to be followed by Graham Pearson. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'm delighted to speak in this afternoon's debate on the Scottish immunisation programme. And I want to start by echoing the Minister's remarks that vaccination is one of the most effective and viable public health interventions that we can deploy to protect people against serious diseases and to prevent the spread of disease. Now, Presiding Officer, in the short time that I have, I want to focus on some of the newer developments in Scotland's vaccination programmes and the contributions that these will make towards improving and protecting the country's public health. Now, we know that the comparatively recent vaccine against meningitis C has shown significant benefits, so I very much welcome last Friday's decision by the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation to recommend the introduction of a vaccine against meningitis B for children at 2, 4 and 12 months of age, as well as the Scottish Government's commitment to working with the Health Department to ensure this vaccine can be introduced as quickly as possible into Scotland's routine childhood immunisation programme. Now, Presiding Officer, I was approached some time ago by a constituent in Dumfries and Galloway whose teenage son has a rare immune system disorder called mannose-binding lactose deficiency, one of the characteristics of which is an extreme susceptibility to a range of serious diseases, including pneumonia and meningitis. Now, the Joint Committee's decision on a meningitis B vaccine was one of vital importance to my constituent and her son, and as members can imagine, is a very welcome one, not just for this family in particular, but I'm sure for other families across Scotland. I'd like to also mention a few words about the HPV vaccination programme, Presiding Officer, that was introduced back in August 2008 under the previous Health Secretary Nicola Sturgeon for 12 to 13-year-old teenage girls in S2, which protects them from 2 types of human papillomavirus that can cause 70% of cervical cancer. Now, since its introduction, uptake in Scotland has exceeded 90%, and we're now seeing significant decreases in the prevalence of HPV among young women as a result. And the positive public health benefits this vaccine is delivering are worth highlighting. And I say this because last year I met members of NHS Dumfries and Galloway's research and development team at the DGRI who have been working on a programme to tackle the problem of cervical smear test defaulters. Now, the national audit of invasive cervical cancer found that around 71% of women who developed cervical cancer had not had a smear test in the preceding 3 years. And in March 2012, the numbers of women in Dumfries and Galloway who were unscreened or underscreened stood at 6,100. Now, the team worked on a variety of approaches to tackle the problem, including sending out self-sampling kits to women who regularly failed to attend for smear tests. And the overwhelming majority of women who undertook self-testing said that they would regularly participate in the screening programme if they could use that method in future. Now, this matters, Presiding Officer, because cervical cancer is currently the only form of cancer against which we can effectively vaccinate. And we know that through the work of various health boards, including at NHS Dumfries and Galloway, that many women are not being regularly screened. And as with all cancers, early detection is crucial. But prevention is far better than the cure, which is why the HPV vaccine is such a significant step forward. In closing, Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government's immunisation programme does make a vital contribution to the promotion of good public health in Scotland. Ultimately, of course, we owe our thanks to the NHS staff who promote and deliver the vaccination programmes, and their efforts have kept our vaccination uptake levels in Scotland very high indeed. So while we can't be complacent, I would like to put on record my thanks for them for helping us to keep the killer diseases of the past at bay and to make us a healthier country for the future.
Many thanks. I now call on Graham Pearson to be followed by Joan McAlpine.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful to be given a chance to contribute to this afternoon's debate, and I rise in support of the motion as amended by my colleague Richard Simpson. The programme of immunisation by vaccination, first introduced within the United Kingdom in the 18th century from Turkey, and work developed by Louis Pasteur in relation to cholera, anthrax and rabies, has no doubt gone a long way to establishing immunisation and vaccination as important principles in health. Indeed, it's been described as one of the great health achievements of the 20th century. In that context, the current performance of government achieving a 97% annual take-up rate on average is excellent news, and one that we should be happy to applaud. Indeed, it gives governments of all hues a giant challenge in maintaining not only 97% annually, but hopefully improving on that number. At the same time, the introduction of new additions in rotavirus and shingles, meningitis and other challenges adds to the pressure that government needs to respond to in ensuring that high levels of immunisation are maintained. It seems to me there are three elements which need particular attention if we are to continue in progress. One has been mentioned before, the workloads faced by staff. And there's no doubt that staff have reported through the NHS Scotland staff surveys of last year that a third of nurses and midwives say that they feel that they have conflicting demands, and that those conflicting demands make it difficult to meet the challenges they face. A quarter think there are not enough staff for them to do the job properly. And this is something that it would be worthwhile the Minister commenting on at the end of this debate. The second element has also been touched on earlier, fear. And there's no doubt that the experience of the controversy over the MMR vaccine has caused a huge downturn at one stage in our development in the uptake of the MMR vaccine. And that uptake has taken a great deal of official time to try and repair. But there's still, in the context of the 97% pickup, a relatively high proportion of 10 to 17-year-olds in Scotland, those about to enter university, some of them, who need to be caught in the catch-up programmes that have been utilised by government. The third challenge that I think government in Scotland face is that world population movement which we now experience and we need to become attuned to. People are moving around the world both for economic and for social reasons, and there's no doubt that others don't have the luxury that we enjoy here in Scotland in terms of access to immunisation on an ongoing basis. The budgets, as referred to in the draft budget reports, indicate a seesawing of figures year on year. For instance, £8.8 million spent in the year 2013-14, rising to £16.3 million 14-15, and then a fall thereafter in some elements of a pandemic flu, for instance. I understand that these seesaws are about the rolling programme of purchasing the necessary medicines that are required for the programme, but it would be good to hear from the Minister that in spite of that rise and fall in budgets, the same numbers of target groups are achieved year on year and are not affected by those changes in numbers. Final comment I'll make is in relation to the shingles vaccine. I received an approach from a number of constituents who seem to think that unless they're in the age group 70 or 79 years, they can't access a vaccination. And in a number of cases, they were 71 and 72 years of age and felt that they would be exempted for a serious number of years. It would be nice to have clarification on that point. I'm very grateful to the Chamber. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call on Joan McAlpine to be followed by Rhoda Grant. 4 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would like to begin by thanking the Minister for his letter of the 21st of March, informing me of the JCVI decision regarding the recommendation of the introduction of the meningitis B vaccine, as it's an issue I had raised with him on behalf of constituents on a number of occasions. I immediately forwarded Mr Matheson's letter to my constituent, Mr Michael Patty, who has been campaigning and fundraising on this issue since he lost his 13-year-old son David to this terrible disease in 1999. I first encountered Mr Patty last July when he wrote to me to express his bitter disappointment when the JCVI failed to recommend the introduction of the vaccine due to it not being cost-effective. And in that letter he wrote, after years of efforts, campaigning and fundraising, we finally have the Holy Grail, a vaccine for the B strain of the disease, which was passed by the European Health Government body as a safe and effective vaccine. And I personally am devastated that this decision by JCVI not to implement has been taken in the UK. I am very pleased that that's now been reversed. The meningitis B vaccine will give 73% protection level, and the catch-22 in this is that cost-effectiveness cannot be ascertained unless it is implemented. But the B strain, which accounts for half of all meningitis deaths, can lead to lifelong disability, and you cannot put the price on a life, particularly a child's life. It's surely significant and persuasive that the estimated lifetime cost of looking after someone severely disabled by meningitis is estimated at £3 million. Presiding Officer, we have heard today about the increase in the immunisation budget of a very considerable 85.2% in a year, and that will further increase in 2015-2016 to almost £21 million, which will cumulatively be 137.5% in just 3 years. Even by the standards of NHS inflation, that rise is considerable. But it's very clear from what we have learned in the debate so far that in the long run, much more money is saved. I would actually be very interested to know, given the government's preventative agenda, if any work has been done to quantify how much money is being saved through particularly the most recent immunisations. For example, from May last year, it's already been mentioned that all babies born in Scotland were offered a rotavirus vaccine for the first time, and it will protect thousands of children from the effects and reduce costly hospital admissions. Until recently, I wasn't aware of the term rotavirus, but as the mother of two, I certainly had plenty of experience of it. My children are now aged 16 and 24, and so didn't receive this protection, but I can remember how frightening severe vomiting and diarrhoea can be in babies and young children, and I can remember several GP call-outs and waits in York Hill, and in one occasion when my daughter became very severely dehydrated, she had a several days stay in hospital. And clearly, apart from the parental distress, it must cost a fortune in terms of time and clinical staff. And as has already been said, 1,200 babies every year have to go to hospital due to the symptoms of rotavirus. And it's estimated that all children will become infected at least once before the age of 5, although I would perhaps put that in the past tense. That's a huge amount of staff time and NHS money that's being saved. And one could say exactly the same thing about the other vaccines that we've heard about today that are more recently introduced, such as the HPV vaccine, which protects against 70% of cervical cancer cases. Although it's only been in place since 2008, we're already seeing some evidence of its effectiveness, and one really can't put a price on the cost of treating a young mother with cervical cancer. Must be extremely expensive, but there's the human cost and the cost to society more generally. So such programmes that have been mentioned by the Minister, and also the Shingles and Influenzas programme, tell us a lot about how much money we could be saving through the immunisation programme. I just want to finish off with the words of my constituent Michael Patty, who has said that although he doesn't see an immediate end to the meningitis B, it's a massive and significant step forward. And in 1999, when he lost his son, he vowed he'd do all he could to prevent other families going through what he had gone through. And needless to say, he said, "I feel delighted at this news." And I think that's a positive note to end on. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks so much. Now Colin Rhoda Grant, to be followed by Jim Eadie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I welcome this debate. I think what has been shown this afternoon is that immunisation can be indeed life-saving, and actually people talking about the devastation that the implications of those diseases that we can now vaccinate against can cause. And I think it was Richard Simpson that talked about 14 vaccinations, not including meningitis B, which has been recently announced. And there are, I think most immunisations are accepted and indeed welcomed, and people take them up. But as we've seen in the past, there are issues. But I think it was Richard Simpson that also mentioned that smallpox has been eradicated due to immunisation, and that is something we could achieve with maybe many other of those diseases. Polio was another one mentioned. We have had scares about immunisation, whooping cough, but also the worst, I think, was the MMR scare, because we shouldn't forget the impact of those diseases. Measles can have really dangerous complications. It can have a brain damage or indeed death, and indeed in some very rare cases there is a fatal degenerative brain condition that can develop after the infection, which is a very worrying symptom. With mumps, we, I think, are very aware of the problems caused by mumps. It can cause deafness, infertility in men and miscarriage in pregnant women. Rubella is another that we are very aware of, especially when it is at its worst if a woman catches it in early pregnancies, which can result in devastating impacts on the baby that is being carried at that point. And that's why people can't receive the MMR when they're pregnant or indeed planning to get pregnant. We also know that before the MMR vaccine came in, meningitis caused through mumps was one of the biggest killers of children. The faults of the intake obviously came as a result of Andrew Wakefield's discredited paper into MMR safety. And it decreased herd immunity, and that is still the case in certain age groups. And that puts babies at risk because, as we found in the Welsh outbreak, early immunisation is not possible. So while they immunised babies as early as possible, you can't do that before 6 months old. So they were in danger. Also in danger is teenagers going to university, and the fewest were immunised between 1998 and 2002. Those groups are now getting to go to university, where they will come in contact with other young people. And these diseases are highly contagious, so therefore if they are contracted, the chances are it would spread very quickly through a university. And given that the symptoms are very much like a cold or the like, they are passed on before they are identified as being something dangerous. And we see the impact. In 1998, there were 56 confirmed cases of measles in the UK. By 2006, that was 13 times greater, and the first death since 1992. And in Ireland, the same thing happened, with 1,500 cases reported because of the decreased vaccination rates following the MMR scare. It is really important that we look to having that herd immunity and work to improve on the figures of those who missed out on immunisation because of the MMR scare. So we need to look at those age groups. Therefore, I would be pleased to hear what the Scottish Government are doing to contact and immunise those groups that were missed because of the scare. We also have to learn lessons from this. Because while specialists kept trying to reassure the public regarding the safety of MMR, and I think Dr. Richard Simpson was quite right in his statement where he said he was being vilified. Anyone who tried to persuade people that there were real dangers of following MMR immunisation were vilified, and it became hugely politicised, a real difficulty within our system. So therefore, I would ask the government to see how they can make sure that there's openness and transparency in the health service with regard to government advice, because I think that is paramount in people trusting it. And we need to build trust in the immunisation, especially of MMR, to make sure this thing doesn't happen again.
Thanks very much. Now call on Jim Meady to be followed by Jamie McGregor. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As previous speakers have outlined, immunisation has played and continues to play an absolutely vital role in protecting and improving the health of the people of Scotland. Richard Simpson put this debate into its proper international context, and globally, according to the World Health Organization, immunisation prevents an estimated 2 to 3 million deaths every year from diseases such as diphtheria, polio, tetanus, whooping cough and measles. And the Public Health Minister reminded us that in Scotland these are diseases now largely confined to the past. That is the extent of the contribution which vaccination and immunisation programmes make to public health, both at home and abroad. It is to be welcomed that the Scottish Government have brought forward a number of additions to Scotland's immunisation programme over the last year and have committed significant additional resources to implement those changes. Notwithstanding the questions which Graham Pearson posed in his contribution, the fact remains that the immunisation budget will have increased by 85%, almost 82% in real terms, in the last year from £8.8 million to £16.3 million. And these additions to Scotland's immunisation programme include the introduction of the rotavirus vaccine, changes to the meningitis C vaccine, the introduction of a shingles vaccine for people aged 70 and a phased catch-up for those aged 71 and 79, and a phased rollout of the childhood flu programme. In all of these areas, the Scottish Government has acted to strengthen further the immunisation programme and to deliver benefits in public health. However, implementing these new additions to the immunisation programme still presents a challenge to the NHS. It will be necessary to ensure that Health Protection Scotland, the Scottish Government and NHS boards work together to implement these changes, a point which was made in the Labour amendment and I think is accepted by the Scottish Government. And without that willingness to work together, we will not be able to ensure that we take forward the additions to the immunisation programme without impacting on existing vaccination programmes. And there are obviously challenges as well in recognising the additional duties that this places on NHS staff. In addition, the Scottish Government has given a clear commitment that it will ensure that the meningitis B vaccine will be introduced as quickly as possible, in line with the recommendations of the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, a point welcomed in the Conservative amendment. Turning to the childhood immunisation programme, immunisation rates have since the mid-1990s consistently stood at around 97% annually at 2 years of age for routine childhood vaccinations. The childhood immunisation statistics for 2012 acknowledge that overall rates of childhood immunisations in Scotland are high and exceed the 95% target rate. However, there is a social gradient whereby rates are lowest among children in the most deprived areas and highest in the least deprived areas, as measured by the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. This important finding from the childhood immunisation statistics underlines the important point that with the right approach and appropriately focused effort, it is surely possible to narrow and then overcome the inequalities associated with deprivation in the area of childhood immunisation. And in the area of childhood immunisation, more needs to be done to close the health inequalities gap. So can I urge the Minister and his officials to explore what further work needs to be undertaken by the Government and the NHS to identify what more can be done in this area. From May last year, all babies born in Scotland were offered the rotavirus vaccine for the first time, protecting tens of thousands of children from its effects and reducing costly hospital admissions, a point effectively made by my colleague Joan McAlpine. This one example brings together a number of important factors: timely and cost-effective intervention, preventative spending and an early years approach, all of which will deliver tangible benefits to the children and families affected. Patrick Harvey talked about gender-neutral human papillomavirus vaccination, and in this issue we heard compelling evidence at the Public Petitions Committee last year from Jamie Ray of the Throat Cancer Foundation, who made the point that in relation to men who have sex with men, there is no protection at all. This is discriminatory, so an issue worthy of further consideration by the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, the development and implementation of national programmes and multi-agency working with appropriate action plans are key to success in public health. The extended immunisation programme is a clear, cost-effective and efficacious exemplar of this approach, and the Scottish Government is to be commended for it.
Thanks so much. Now call on Jamie McGregor to be followed by Colin Keir. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to take part in today's debate
As a father of 6 children, 4 of whom are still at school, I'm very aware of the immunisations our young people receive to protect them from illnesses and infection. And I should also declare an interest in that I have had a number of childhood illnesses, including whooping cough, which I also contracted again more recently as an adult, and measles, and Germany measles, which children are now routinely vaccinated against. As a sufferer from some respiratory problems now, I also take advantage of the yearly flu jab, which is so important for so many of our vulnerable constituents. All of us today would wish to pay tribute to all those Scottish NHS staff who were involved in delivering our immunisation programme, which is without doubt one of the biggest health successes of the last 100 years. And we should also today express our gratitude to the scientists whose research has allowed us to have the vaccinations we often take for granted. We're fortunate to live in a modern world where both smallpox and polio, which were formerly so common and did so much damage, are no longer things to be feared thanks to immunisation. And indeed, the World Health Organization declared smallpox wiped out in December 1979, and Europe was declared free from polio in 2002. However, we must never be complacent. We know that it is vital that in order to maintain progress, uptake rates remain as high as possible. It's reassuring that uptake rates in under 24-month children for primary courses of immunisation against diphtheria, tetanus, whooping cough, polio, Hib, Mense and PCV have exceeded the 95% target for the last decade. Let us hope this continues, and indeed let us aim for the highest possible uptakes. Having said this, I have sympathy with parents who may have been concerned, and sometimes are concerned, that a small percentage of children may be severely affected by types of immunisation, such as that for whooping cough. This was, of course, brought about by a lot of speculation in the press over MMR and whooping cough vaccines. But it is important to make the case that some sacrifice has to be made sometimes for the benefit of the huge majority, albeit that this sacrifice should be kept to an absolute minimum and, if possible, eliminated altogether. As medical technology becomes ever more advanced and as new health challenges emerge, it is right and proper that health experts consider what additional immunisations might benefit our people. Therefore, as other members have done, I too welcome the recent news that the meningitis B vaccine talked about in Nanette Mills' amendment is to be introduced into the routine childhood immunisation programme at 2, 4 and 12 months of age. Men-B occurs mostly in infants and children under 5 and is fatal in around 10% of cases, with 1 in 8 cases experiencing serious long-term health problems such as amputations, deafness or epilepsy. It's a real boost to parents' confidence that children will be protected in future from this terrible disease. Deputy Presiding Officer, I'd also like to say just a word as a farmer myself about the immunisations in the agricultural industry, which have made such a difference
40 seconds.
to the loss of animals. And I think that's a very important thing and should be remembered. Thank you.
Many thanks. Much appreciated. I'll call on Colin Keir, after which we'll move to the closing speeches. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to have been called to this debate. Having joined the Health Committee just before Christmas, I wasn't aware just how effective the immunisation programme actually was, and it was well pointed out by the Minister and indeed Richard Simpson. So given the proven record of success, I'm delighted that the Scottish Government have identified the need to increase the funding for the immunisation budget, and as mentioned by Jimmy D, the rise from 8.8 million to 16.3 last year, along with the future proposals for the rise in budget, are to be welcomed. Just as I was waiting and listening to the other speeches, the thing crossed my mind that this year we are commemorating the Great War, and for many of those who fought in the trenches in terrible conditions and thought they had survived, they were unfortunately afflicted, many of them, by a particularly virulent type of flu, which ravaged somewhere worldwide between 20 and 40 million people after that war. A particularly bad kick in the teeth. So that's the type of fight we have against these viruses, and the improving setup we have, improving viruses, virus protection, is absolutely important, and we can see with some of the very fine speeches we've heard throughout this debate just how important this is. So I suspect many in this chamber have seen the effects of what they see as full-blown flu. It's not the sort of thing you phone into work and say, I've got the flu. It's not like that. It's very close to pneumonia. It's not the sort of thing you live with and get through very quickly and head back to work. So I was delighted to see that for the first time in 2013, the flu vaccine was offered to children from the age of 2 to 17, as well as those who are vulnerable or at the risk of suffering serious consequences because of flu. And with the childhood flu programme being offered to 120,000 2- and 3-year-olds and around 100,000 primary school-aged children, it may help against one of the constant scourges of early family health, something which my father used to refer to children as walking petri dishes, because everybody in the family got it, and every time it happened, it was because the schools had all returned and all the kids were being infected by each other. He was a little bit sarcastic towards that. But the remarkable thing that I found with the research that I've found is actually the uptake within the Scottish childhood immunisation programme. As has been mentioned earlier, 97% is a phenomenal uptake. And it would be interesting to know, for those of us who are not up to speed, is just why the extra 3% don't take this up. I know there's bound to be some reasons, health or whatever. And I welcome the changes that have occurred in the programme over the past year, the rotavirus vaccine, May 2013, the changes to the meningitis C, I think it was vaccine last June, and the introduction of the shingles vaccine, all have been mentioned earlier. And I welcome the speedy introduction, has also been mentioned, of the meningitis B vaccines, because I do remember the absolute worry that my parents had when a member of my family was diagnosed with it many, many years ago. Really, particularly back in the 1960s when less was known about this. So there are serious consequences for this. I'm aware I'm running out of time. I'd love to say more, but in researching this subject, I can honestly say that this is probably one of the most important things that we can do as a government, is to keep, or as a parliament, is to keep the research going and to find the answers to some of these horrible problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we now move to closing speeches, and I call on Jackson Carlisle. Up to 5 minutes, please, Mr Carlisle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This has been a short debate this afternoon, but it has been a well-informed debate. And I don't mean in any sense to sound patronising when I say that it was clear to me that nearly every contributor this afternoon was contributing because they wished to contribute to the course of the debate, rather than the impression sometimes we have that maybe one or two people have been asked to contribute rather than necessarily have wanted to volunteer. And because of that, I think that there were, throughout the chamber, no disagreement, which was not a surprise, but a collection of different experiences and anecdotes, all of which I think went to underpin the importance of the whole vaccination and immunisation programme. I thought the three principal speeches from the Minister, detailing the public health benefits of the various immunisation programmes, Scotland's record on all the key vaccines, and also the contributions from Richard Simpson and Nanette Milne, gave that rounded picture of the history and the success that Scotland has had. And without repeating what has already been said, it seems to me, as somebody who's not a doctor, and there were certainly several who were contributing this afternoon, that the key thing is that, by and large, politicians are not experts. And although in recent times public scepticism in experts is a growing modern phenomenon, I think sometimes, given the rather curious specialisations some people can claim to be experts in, we have to mount a vigorous campaign at all times to ensure that the public suspend any scepticism that they have in clinical and pharmaceutical experts, because we have to trust their judgment. We have to trust their judgment on the introduction, the sustainability or the withdrawal of individual vaccination programmes. And the Minister was right, and others, to highlight just how quickly a disease can take root, and the sharp reminder that the MMR crisis of a few years past gave us, if we allow those who are sceptical about the advice we receive and act upon to allow that to take root in their operational practice. Now, the HPV human papillomavirus has been referred to several times this afternoon, and it's interesting. It is a relatively recently introduced vaccination, and a very important one, and I thought Aileen MacLeod, at some detail and length, spelled out just what its benefits and what the success of that has been. But there will be several members in the Chamber who have attended meetings with representations from some to the Parliament who have expressed concerns about its introduction. They are, even today, I think, emailing some of us with evidence from Japan. And I think the important thing I say to them, echoing the comments that I opened with a moment ago, is that it is the duty and the responsibility of Parliament not to react to that, but to trust the judgment of those people that give ministers the evidence and the advice on which they have to act. And for us, as Aileen MacLeod did, to exemplify just what a benefit and advantage the introduction of these vaccines have done. And I listened as well to the intervention from Patrick Harvey, and Jim Eadie touched on this too, of the extension of this vaccination to young men, and I believe that is something which I too in the Petitions Committee heard representations on, which I hope advice and evidence progresses, which allows the correct, a fresh recommendation to follow. Richard Simpson talked about 14 vaccines. He also introduced the subject of smallpox, and I must commend a recent BBC4 series which showed just how astonishing the progress in elimination of a disease like smallpox, which ravaged various parts of the world recently enough for the contemporary footage to be in graphic colour. And I realised that whilst I had perhaps seen one or two sensationalised photographs, to be confronted with just how devastating and damaging a disease like smallpox had been, and then to see not those in this country that we've paid tribute to, but those who in the 60s and 70s volunteered to go and to eradicate and eliminate that disease in other parts of the world, and to recognise just how unassuming these individuals, how ordinary these individuals were who made that commitment and achieved that success, I think is in this context to demonstrate and redefine the concept of heroism. The big challenge, of course, will be not just where we are today, but, as I've referred in other debates, to the enormous clinical, surgical and pharmaceutical progress we're seeing, and the challenges that are going to come for us to keep pace with the opportunities that future vaccinations will provide. That is the challenge for the government going forward. I think we all support and commend the government on the work they are doing to date and the response to the challenges that they have made.
Many thanks. Now call on Dr. Richard Simpson. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I commend Jackson Carlo for his summing up speech, which I think identified some of the political issues in an exemplary way. The greatest public health achievements have been clean water and sanitation, cleaner air, recognition of tobacco as a hazard. I have to say only 4 centuries after James VI, the first of England, recognised its evils. But as the Minister, Graham Pearson and many others have said, of all the achievements, vaccines are one of the greatest. And there is more to come. There's no doubt about that. Jamie McGrigor was right to praise our scientists for their innovation, not only in the human vaccines, but also in the field of veterinary science, where it is also important. Successive governments have delivered a world-class vaccination programme. Lives have been saved. Cervical cancer is prevented by HPV vaccine rather than relying solely on cervical screening with its shortcomings, as was illustrated by Aileen MacLeod. The new vaccines, rotavirus, the phasing in of the intranasal influenza virus for children, and the shingles virus for the over 70s will all further enhance the quality of many lives. These are worthwhile investments, as will be the meningitis B vaccine. The potential for extension to boys of HPV, which referred to by Patrick Harvey, to achieve herd immunity would mirror the switch from a rubella only for girls, which was really very difficult as a programme to try and eliminate rubella and particularly prevent problems in pregnancy, as Rhoda Grant indicated, to MMR for all. And we should not forget the international picture is quite different, because the success of eradication of smallpox that Jackson Carlo referred to, the near eradication of polio, the substantial reduction in measles, the progress in yellow fever, and the prospect of a useful vaccine to tackle resurgent malaria are all welcome. As Jim Eadie said, the international programmes may be saving already 2 to 3 million lives a year. Colin Keir quite rightly reminded us of the deaths from Spanish flu after the First World War. Further pandemics are inevitable, and we do need to be prepared for them. Let us hope they are as soft in their effect as the swine flu was. The new TB vaccine that's being developed in India to replace or add to the BCG will be welcome if validated. But in the meantime, we need to scrutinise our TB detection programme in at-risk groups. There's a significant rise in TB and in resistant TB, and I'm not convinced our detection programmes are absolutely adequate. At home, the measles outbreak, though not anything like the levels of the 60s, as the Minister and Nanette Milne graphically reminded us, and the increases in mumps also because of the MMR problem, but fortunately also not in Scotland. But they do suggest that the decline in uptake left by the MMR debacle hasn't been fully repaired. And along with my colleague Rhoda Grant, I still have concerns that both measles and mumps in relation to the MMR, the decision not to have a national advertising campaign may yet expose some older adults to all three diseases. I hope I'm wrong. But I would ask that the media failures in the 80s on pertussis and the 90s in NMR are taught in journalism courses in colleges. Joan McAlpine might be able to help us with that. Whilst general uptake of all vaccines is good, it's not clear from the routinely published data that the degree to which there is a differential uptake in socioeconomic groups. And I think that is something that we should look at in terms of standard publication. Jim Eadie made a plea for us to look closely at areas of health inequalities. It is always the percentages for which the uptakes are not met that need to be looked at carefully. Why is this happening? What are the barriers to it? And can we improve on it? On what is otherwise an excellent programme. Graham Pearson referred, as I did, to the pressures on staff, which we've mentioned in our motion. And as Graham Pearson said, these are significant. And whilst the efforts of our staff should again be applauded because they've done a fantastic job, we need to acknowledge these pressures. And I hope that there will be monitoring of the midwife's input in terms of both within pregnancy and post-pregnancy, where their involvement in the vaccination programme, not just in terms of advice, but in actually physically giving the vaccines, I think is something that merits attention. Finally, we may see more new vaccines, like the most recent meningitis B recommended through the UK Joint Committee for Vaccination and Immunisation. Joan McAlpine quite rightly reminded us of the excellent campaign that's been run, and we often do rely on individuals who have suffered from the failures of our regimes to actually bring to our attention fully the need for new measures to be undertaken. And this has been a very successful campaign, which I think helped the Joint Vaccine Committee to take the step of introducing this vaccine. Joan McAlpine also reminded us of the costs, but also the benefits of prevention in children in the reduced cost and time for hospitals. Deputy Presiding Officer, I want to finish having, I think, recognised this has been a very consensual debate, as it should be, and the support that we will give to the government motion and its immunisation programme. But we will continue to be critical where appropriate. The one concern I have is that we've managed to get through this whole debate without mentioning the referendum in September. But I would say that the JCVI has served us well. And I wonder what our approach is going to be after September the 18th, were we to be independent. Would we be accepting JCVI determinations, but without any Scottish representation? Because Scottish representatives have made a huge input. Or would we be setting up our own vaccination and immunisation advisory committee, as ERA have done with its National Immunisation Advisory Committee? So what plans do the government have in the, I hope, unlikely event of them winning that referendum?
Many thanks. I now call on Minister Michael Matheson to wind up the debate. Minister, you have until 5 o'clock.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think this has been a very useful debate, and I'm happy to say from the very outset that we, in this closing stage of the debate, that we're happy to accept both the amendments that are being proposed by Labour and the Conservative Party. But I think it's actually been a very helpful debate for the very reasons that I think Nanette Millen outlined in her speech, is that our national vaccination programme is largely taken for granted, in that it happens, it takes place, and it's a very effective programme. It's one of these programmes that, as soon as one element of it ever went wrong, it would very quickly become a major public health challenge and a major public health concern. So I think it's to tremendous credit of the staff, particularly within our public health sector and within our primary care sector, but how successfully they have managed our vaccination programme over many years, and we can rightfully be very proud of that, because it's a programme that, as members have highlighted, that extends from newborn babies right through to the older members of our community. But as a number of members have highlighted in their own contributions, the vaccination programme is not one which stands still. We saw, as a result of vaccination programmes both at a national and at a global level, the effective eradication of some conditions. For example, as Richard Simpson made reference to, smallpox, and we have saw the way in which we've been able to eradicate polio since 2002 within Europe. All of these are factors which are a result of good, effective immunisation and vaccination programmes. So we are very lucky to have what is a very safe and reliable vaccination programme here in Scotland, in order to make sure that we can have that type of confidence in the way in which the process operates. Now, I want in particular, though, to pick up on the issue that Richard Simpson and Graham Pearson highlighted in their remarks, the concern about pressure on staff and the demand that the vaccination programme places on staff. I am acutely aware of the pressure that our staff are under in delivering the vaccination programmes. And the reason that I am acutely aware of it is because I am extremely conscious that, in order to maintain public confidence in our immunisation programmes, we need to make sure that they are robust and that they apply the science for which the vaccination programmes have been developed effectively right across the country. And I want to maybe just give members an illustration of the nature of some of the challenges which we do face. There has been an ever-increasing number of vaccinations introduced into the vaccination programme. A significant number of those vaccinations and immunisations are one-off, or 1 or 2 or 3 immunisations that are required at any given time in someone at some point in a young person's life or an older person's life. But the flu vaccination programme is an example of a vaccination programme that has to take place every single year. And by the introduction and the extension of the flu vaccination programme to those between the age of 2 and 17, it almost effectively, overnight, doubles the numbers in our childhood immunisation programme. That is a very significant logistic challenge which we need to undertake. And now, in order to deal with that, what we've been doing in the first year is using a number of different pilots in different health board areas in order to test out different approaches and then to get feedback from staff on what they feel is the most appropriate approach. Doing that with different age groups in order to find out what's the best approach. So for older kids, there's an element where, under supervision, they can actually do some self-immunisation within a class group, and also different approaches with different age groups within primary schools as well. So what we're trying to do is to work with staff to identify what's the best way in which to do that. But the other challenge in that is that we very often only require the staff to undertake these immunisation programmes for a short period of time at any given point during the year. We don't require them to undertake immunisation and vaccination programmes right through the rest of the year as well. So it is a particular challenge, and that's why we will introduce it over a number of years. I know there are some who would like to see it happening much quicker, but my view is that we should take our time to get it right, to work with the staff, in order to make sure we have a robust system in place and that the public can have confidence in the processes which we have in place as well. Can I say that I think Jackson Carlow, in his closing remarks, made an extremely important point, is that very often the approaches which we take on different immunisation programmes is not through personal government choice. It's led by expert advice that is presented to government. An expert advice that we receive, whether it be from the Joint Committee on Vaccinations and Immunisations or whether it be from Health Protection Scotland, is advice that we then react to. We then respond to their expert input in this area. This is not a field where I'm certainly not an expert in any shape or fashion. This is an area where we are very much led by experts. And when Richard Simpson raised the issue about a catch-up programme for those kids who may have lost out on MMR vaccine in the 1990s, the approach which we have taken is based upon expert advice that's been provided to ministers from Health Protection Scotland. If Health Protection Scotland believe that there should be a different approach, then I'm more than happy to take that different approach from what we've been doing to date. So I want to reassure members that there is certainly no complacency whatsoever in this agenda. This has been led very much by the expert advice we receive. If that changes, we will respond to that in a positive way for the very good reasons as to why we should. And on the expert advice, as Graham Pearson raised in his own comments regarding the shingle vaccination, concern that some older people have had about whether they're entitled to it because they're 72 or 73, and those when they will receive the vaccination. The approach that's been taken, the introduction of this particular vaccination, is based on the JCVI advice. And that is, we should start off with those who turn 70 and those who are 79, in order to catch those at 79 before they become 80, and also to get those as soon as they move into becoming the age of 70. And what we should then do over a number of years is run a catch-up programme for those in between those age groups. So every time when somebody turns 70, they will automatically then receive the vaccination. If they move up to, if they are 79, they will receive the vaccination. And then over the next 3 to 4 years, we'll have the catch-up programme for those in between. So I recognise that some may be concerned that they haven't received it yet, but again, we are taking an approach which has been recommended to us by the experts as being the most robust approach to take. It is fair to say, there are some limitations around the shingles vaccination in terms of its availability. I understand there is only one manufacturer of the particular vaccine, which has limited availability, which again is part of the reason for the rollout programme which we are taking forward. Presiding Officer, I'm also conscious that our vaccination programme does have to be placed within the context of the international agenda. Some members may be aware that recently in Syria, wild polio was identified, which immediately resulted in the World Health Organization advising that if a single case is identified in Europe where polio is eradicated, then it will result in the release of oral polio vaccination stockpiles in Scotland. So we have to take forward our vaccination programme and our immunisation programme within that global context, but also to make sure that we have a robust system in place that's able to respond to new vaccines as they come along, and to do so in a safe and informed way. I think in this debate, Presiding Officer, all members recognise that Scotland is well placed to be able to continue to build on the success of its vaccination programme in recent years, and this government is intending to make sure that we continue to do that in order to continue to gain the public health benefits that have come from vaccination programmes for several decades now in Scotland.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes the debate on the immunisation programme. We now move to the next item of business, which is decision time. There are 6 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is amendment number 9447.2 in the name of Mark Griffin, which seeks to amend motion number 9447 in the name of Keith Brown on young and novice drivers and graduated driver licensing be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The amendment is therefore agreed to. The next question is amendment number 9447.1 in the name of Alex Johnson, which seeks to amend motion number 9447 in the name of Keith Brown on young and novice drivers and graduated driver licensing be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 9447.1 in the name of Alex Johnson is as follows. Yes, 17. No, 94. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is that motion number 9447 in the name of Keith Brown as amended on young and novice drivers and graduated driving licensing be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is not agreed to. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 9447 in the name of Keith Brown as amended is as follows. Yes, 94. No, 17. There were no abstentions. The motion as amended is therefore agreed to. The next question is amendment number 9446.1 in the name of Richard Simpson, which seeks to amend motion number 9446 in the name of Michael Matheson on the immunisation programme be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The amendment is therefore agreed to. The next question is amendment number 9446.2 in the name of Nanette Milne, which seeks to amend motion number 9446 in the name of Michael Matheson on the immunisation programme be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The amendment is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 9446 in the name of Michael Matheson as amended on the immunisation programme be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. Members who leave the chamber should do so quickly and quietly.